Garrick Vale grabbed Mabel Whitlock by both wrists before she could take a single step backward, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks, and dragged her out of the doorway of her father's house while the whole street watched and did nothing. "You want to play accountant," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice carrying that particular ugliness of a man who has never once been told no. "Then let's show this town what kind of woman keeps digging through another man's private business." He shoved her forward into the square, and the rope was already waiting. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever watched someone get punished simply for knowing too much, please subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far Mabel's story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The rope bit into Mabel Whitlock's wrists the way cold wire does, not all at once, but slow and deliberate, tightening with every small movement she made. She stopped moving. That was the first thing she decided, standing there in the gray morning light of Copper Hollow's main square, with the rough wooden slats of an old freight wagon pressing into her back. She stopped moving because she understood, with absolute clarity, that every flinch she made was entertainment for someone standing 10 feet away from her. There were already maybe 30 people gathered. She could hear them arriving, the shuffle of boots on packed dirt, the low murmur of voices being carefully kept quiet, the way people get quiet when they want to watch something happen but don't want to be seen enjoying it too much. Mabel did not look at any of them directly. She stared at the far end of the square, at the weathered sign above the feed store that read Haskins Grain and Dry Goods, and she breathed. Her wrists were bound in front of her with a length of coarse rope that one of Garrick Vale's men had knotted with what she suspected was practiced efficiency. Not a ranch hand's knot. Tight, deliberate, designed to hold without cutting off blood entirely, which told her it had been planned. This was not an accident or a moment of temper. This was arranged. She turned that thought over carefully while she stood very still and let the morning get colder around her. Behind her right shoulder she could hear Garrick Vale's voice, smooth, unhurried, explaining something to Sheriff Pete Alcott. She caught pieces of it, words like stolen in documents and unfit in reputation. She had been listening to variations of that voice for most of her adult life in this town, the voice men use when they want a thing to sound inevitable, when they want a crowd to feel like witnesses to justice instead of participants in something they should be ashamed of. Sheriff Alcott said something back that Mabel couldn't make out clearly. Garrick said, louder this time, "She brought this on herself, Pete." I gave her every courtesy. There was a short silence. "All right," the sheriff said. That single word landed in Mabel's stomach like a stone dropped into still water. She had known Pete Alcott since she was 11 years old. He had eaten supper at her father's table twice that she could remember. He had a wife who bought preserves from Mabel every summer without fail. All right, she breathed out slowly through her nose. Okay. She knew where she stood now. The crowd was larger, maybe 50 people, which in Copper Hollow represented a significant fraction of the population that was willing to leave breakfast to watch something unpleasant. She recognized faces. The Harker brothers from the mill. Ada Pruitt from the dressmaker's shop, who had asked Mabel only 3 weeks prior to help her calculate whether she could afford new bolts of cloth before spring. Mrs. Clement, who taught the younger children their letters, and who was currently pressing her lips together in an expression Mabel couldn't quite read: discomfort, maybe, but not enough discomfort to make her leave. Mabel's father, Thomas Whitlock, was standing near the edge of the gathered crowd with both his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes fixed somewhere around the level of her knees. He hadn't looked up once since they brought her out. She understood that too. Her father was 61 years old, a man with a small piece of leased land and 2 aging horses and a debt with the Vale family that stretched back 4 years to a hard winter when the cattle prices collapsed. She knew the exact size of that debt because she kept his accounts. She knew it the way she knew the square footage of their barn and the average yield of the kitchen garden, and roughly how many weeks they could sustain themselves if the creek ran low in August. She knew everything about her father's life in precise practical terms, and she knew, standing there with the rope around her wrists, that the reason he couldn't look at her was because he had made a calculation, and she had come out on the losing side of it. Garrick stepped forward into her line of sight. He was wearing a good coat, the dark wool one he kept for when he wanted people to understand, without him having to say it, that he was a man of substance. He had a handsome face in a regular, predictable way, strong jaw and light eyes and hair that stayed in order without visible effort. He looked like what people in towns like Copper Hollow meant when they said a man had prospects. "Mabel," he said. He said it gently, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with contempt. She looked at him. "I want you to understand that nobody wanted it to come to this." She said nothing. "If you had simply returned what you took from my father's office." "I didn't take anything from your father's office," Mabel said. Her voice came out flat and steady, which surprised her, because there was a sound somewhere inside her chest that was not steady at all. I looked at the accounts you asked me to review. That's what we agreed on. Nobody asked you to memorize what wasn't your business. You can't memorize numbers on a page and then untake them from your own head, Garrick. Something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly, something more controlled than that. He leaned slightly forward, and his voice dropped just enough that the nearest edge of the crowd had to strain to hear. Kindest thing that happens to you today is that you stand there quietly and wait for this to be finished. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Mabel held his gaze. I understand it perfectly. He stepped back, his face smoothed over again into its careful, well-constructed version of regret. She was in my father's private office without permission, he announced to the crowd, the gentleness now turned outward and enlarged for general consumption. She had access to our accounts because my father trusted the Whitlock family. Trust was repaid with theft. He paused. I think we all understand why a woman who was made to feel unwelcome might take out her disappointment in ways that aren't appropriate. There it was. Mabel heard the shift in the crowd, not loud, but unmistakable. The soft murmur of a story slotting into place. The narrative that Garrick had been building for 3 days, that had traveled from the Vale Ranch into town through a dozen careful conversations. Mabel Whitlock had set her cap at Garrick Vale. Garrick had declined, and a woman like her, heavyset, unmarried, 24 years old, and still in her father's house, had reacted the way desperate women react. She was aware of her own body in a way she usually managed to suppress. Breadth of her hips, and the fullness of her arms, and the fact that she took up space in a particular way that people in Copper Hollow had always felt entitled to have opinions about. She was aware of it because Garrick Vale had just made it the explanation. This is why. Not because she had discovered something real, not because she had seen the numbers, not because she was inconvenient in ways that had nothing to do with her figure, just because she was what she was, and that was supposed to be enough to make everything else make sense. Her jaw was tight. She loosened it deliberately. A horse came around the north end of the square at an unhurried walk. She noticed it the way you notice things at the edge of vision when you are holding very still movement where movement hadn't been before. The animal was a gray roan, solid-built, trail-tired in the look of its haunches, but moving easily. The man on its back sat the saddle the way some men do when riding is so habitual it doesn't register as effort anymore. He wore a coat that had been good once and was now simply functional. He had a hat pulled down against the cold. He was looking at her. Not the way most of the crowd was looking at her. Not with the sideways hunger of people watching something they're pretending not to enjoy. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something that doesn't make sense yet, direct and thoughtful, like a man trying to understand a piece of machinery he hasn't seen before. He pulled the roan to a stop at the edge of the square. He didn't dismount right away. He sat there for a moment and looked at the rope, and then at her hands, and then at Garrick Vale, and then at the sheriff. Morning, he said finally, to no one in particular. Sheriff Alcott turned. Help you? Passing through, the man said. What's the law here says you can tie a woman to a wagon? The silence that followed was the particular quality of silence that happens in a crowd when something shifts unexpectedly and nobody has had time to decide yet what the new rules are. Alcott straightened. This is a matter of, I'm not asking about the matter, the man said. I'm asking about the law, specifically the part that lets you use a rope. He looked around the square in a slow, unhurried way. Because I've been through a fair number of territories, and I haven't seen that particular statute in any of them. Garrick stepped forward. Stranger, you're interrupting a private town. Private. He looked at the 50 gathered people with a mild expression. Seems fairly public to me. His name was Colter Dane, though nobody in Copper Hollow knew that yet. He was 38 years old, and he had spent a large portion of those years in situations that required him to calculate quickly how much trouble he was willing to take on. He was making that calculation now, sitting on his horse in the gray morning of a Wyoming Territory settlement he had never visited, looking at a woman bound with rope to a freight wagon while a crowd of people watched, and a man in a good coat talked about private matters. Calculation did not take long. He got down from the horse. It was not a dramatic dismount. He didn't move quickly or make any display of it. He simply swung down, dropped the reins, and walked across the square toward Mabel, with his hand already going to his belt knife. 3 people moved to intercept him. 2 of them were Vale Ranch hands. The third was a large man whose name Mabel didn't know, one of the men who'd been helping run the rope earlier. Colter stopped. He looked at the 3 men with an expression of genuine, unhurried consideration. I'm going to cut that rope, he said. That's all I'm doing. If there's a law against it, show me in writing, and I'll stop. Otherwise, I'd prefer it if you got out of my way. You don't know what she did, the first ranch hand said. Doesn't matter. She stole still doesn't matter. Colter kept his voice level. A rope's a rope. Either there's law behind it or there isn't. And Pete Alcott there can't tell me there is because there isn't. So, he looked at the three men for another moment. You want to make a decision here, make it. I'll wait. The three men looked at each other. Then at Garrick. Garrick's jaw had gone tight, and something in his face had gotten very still in a way that told Mabel he was recalculating, not panicking, but adjusting. She had seen that expression across a desk when the numbers came up wrong. One of the ranch hands stepped aside. After a moment, the other two did too. Colter walked past them to the wagon. He stopped in front of Mabel. Up close, he was taller than he'd seemed on the horse, with a weathered face and light gray eyes and a scar along his jawline that had healed badly and without much attention. He looked at her hands, then at the knot, then at her face. You all right? He said. It was a quiet question meant for her and not the crowd. I'm standing, she said. He pulled his knife and cut the rope in 2 clean strokes. Pressure released from her wrists, and she became aware of how tight it had been only in the moment it stopped. She kept her arm still, didn't rub her wrists, didn't make any sound. He stepped back immediately. Didn't offer a hand, didn't touch her, didn't position himself in front of her. He just stepped back and gave her room. Mabel stood for a moment. She became aware that the square was completely silent. She raised her hands and looked at the rope still looped around her wrists, which she pulled free herself and let fall to the dirt. Then she looked up at the gathered crowd of Copper Hollow Ada Pruitt and the Harker brothers and Mrs. Clement with her pressed lips, and her father with his eyes still lowered, and she looked at each of them in turn, slow enough that it wasn't accidental, slow enough that it meant something. Nobody laughed. Nobody said anything. She looked at Garrick Vale last. He was watching her with that controlled, adjusting expression, and she could see him deciding that this had become a temporary setback rather than a permanent problem. She could see him thinking ahead. She had gotten good at reading his face across account books, and what it said now was, this isn't finished. She already knew that. Mabel turned and walked out of the square. Colter Dane fell in beside her at a slight distance without being asked. Neither of them spoke for half a block. Then Mabel said, without looking at him, "Where are you headed?" "Ranch north of the ridge," he said. "Working on getting it operational again. Just came to town for grain." "Did you get it?" A pause. Got distracted. She almost laughed. It surprised her. "I'm Mabel Whitlock." "Colter Dane." They walked another 20 feet. "What did you actually do?" he asked. Not accusatory, just asking. "I looked at numbers they didn't want me to see," she said. "And then I remembered them." He considered this. "And what's in the numbers?" Mabel glanced at him sideways for the first time. He was looking forward, watching the road, his face giving nothing particular away. "Something worth a rope," she said. He nodded, like that was a reasonable answer. "You have somewhere to go?" She thought about her father's house. She thought about the way Thomas Whitlock's eyes had stayed fixed at the level of her knees. "Not currently," she said. "I've got a spare room," Colter said. "Nothing special about it. More of a storage situation at the moment, but there's a door and a bed frame. I don't need charity. Didn't offer any. If you can keep accounts, I've got accounts that need keeping. And from what I just watched, you can probably keep accounts." Mabel looked at him again, longer this time. He was still watching the road with that same level expression. "What do you pay?" she said. He named a figure. It was fair. She told him so, and they shook on it right there on the dirt road while Copper Hollow watched from a distance and tried to figure out what exactly had just happened in its town square. The road north out of Copper Hollow ran through scrub and low cedar before the land opened up toward the ridge, and they made the first part of it in companionable quiet, which was the best kind because nobody had to perform anything. Colter's roan was patient and sensible, and Mabel walked beside it on the verge where the ground was firmer, and after a while the sounds of the settlement faded enough that she could hear the wind working through the dry grass and the distant complaint of a hawk somewhere above the ridgeline. Her wrists were sore. She kept her hands loose at her sides and didn't think about it. "You know the Vale family?" Colter asked. "I know their accounts," she said. "Better. Usually. You do that kind of work regular?" "Numbers?" "Since I was 14. My father couldn't manage the columns while his eyes started going and arithmetic gave him headaches." "Get over." She paused. "I got good at it." Word gets around in a small settlement. Other people started asking. Ranchers who couldn't read contracts. Farm wives who needed to check whether their credit was being applied right at the store. She glanced at him. "You'd be amazed how often it's applied wrong." "Probably wouldn't," he said. She thought he was a man of dry humor, the kind that doesn't announce itself. She tucked that away. "How long has the Vale family been in the territory?" Colter asked. "Bram Vale came out 20 years ago from somewhere back east," Mabel said. "Started with 200 head and a willingness to do whatever the land required. He's not stupid, I want to be clear about that. He knows cattle, and he knows weather, and he knows how to read a season. He got where he is through genuine ability." She paused. "And then sometime in the last 5 or 6 years, Genuine ability stopped being enough for what he wanted. And what does he want? Water, she said simply. Ironwater Creek runs year-round. Even in August, when everything else is down to a trickle, Ironwater runs. The ranchers that have access to it can sustain herd all winter. The ones who don't have to buy water rights or sell off early. She watched the road ahead. Bram Vale owns his section of the creek, but it's not enough. He wants more. Colter was quiet for a moment. And where does his land end and other people's begin? That's the question, isn't it? Mabel said. She didn't say more than that yet. The details of what she'd seen in the Vale account books were still sorting themselves in her mind, not the numbers, which she remembered perfectly, but the implications. The pattern of what the numbers meant when you set them beside the surveyor's maps she'd found in the same drawer. She needed to think before she talked. That was a habit she'd developed early, being a woman in a territory where being right wasn't always the same as being believed. The ranch came into view around the bend of a low hill. She stopped walking for a moment. It was rough. That was the fair word for it. The main house was a one-story structure of unpeeled log and caulked board, solid-looking but unfinished at one end where new logs waited to be fitted. There was a barn that needed new siding on the north wall. Fencing ran in 3 directions from a central post and was good in some sections and badly sagged in others. A corral held 2 horses besides the roan one bay, one a leggy sorrel that was watching their approach with interest. A woodpile beside the house suggested someone had been working hard and recently. What she noticed and filed away because it mattered was that all of it was structurally sound. The house sat level. The barn's bones were good. The fence posts were deep and straight where they'd been set by whoever originally built this place. Whoever was working on it now understood what could be salvaged and was salvaging it, rather than tearing down and starting over. She thought that said something useful about Colter Dane. "How long have you had it?" she asked. 8 months, he said. Previous owner died without heirs. The territorial office had it sitting on a list for 2 years before I came across the filing. He looked at the house with the specific expression of a man who has spent a significant portion of 8 months arguing with uncooperative materials. Getting there. "Your accounts are what kind of mess?" she asked. "The kind where I'm not sure whether I'm ahead of my debt or behind it. Do you have paper records?" "I have a box," he said, which told her a great deal. "All right," she said, "let's see the box." The box was genuinely a box, a wooden crate that had previously held hardware, now containing an accumulation of receipts, invoices, contract copies, supply lists, and handwritten notes in a script that was serviceable but not organized around any system Mabel recognized as intentional. She sat at the rough-hewn table in the main room with the crate in front of her and began laying things out in a grid across the available surface. Colter made coffee. He didn't offer to help with the papers, which was the right instinct. He put a cup near her elbow and sat on the far side of the table and watched for a while, then got up and started working on something involving a window frame that had been sticking. The sounds of the ranch settled around her, the occasional knock of a hammer, the horses moving in the corral, the wind against the one finished window, and Mabel worked. She had a memory for figures that she'd never been able to fully explain to anyone who didn't have it. It wasn't that she saw the numbers differently. It was more like each number carried a slight weight, a texture, so that when she saw the same sequence twice in different documents, she recognized it the way you recognize a face, immediately, and without having to count back through the details. Within an hour, she had identified 3 suppliers who were charging Colter prices that didn't match the regional averages she knew from doing other people's accounts. Within 2 hours, she had reconstructed enough of his feed and materials costs to tell him, with reasonable confidence, that he was currently $9 ahead of his outstanding debt, not behind it. She set down her pencil. "You're ahead." Colter stopped with the window frame. "You sure?" "Henderson's Dry Goods has been adding a handling charge to every order that isn't in his published rates. It's small enough each time that it's easy to miss. But added up over 8 months, it's about $14. Quiet for a moment. It's also worth noting that you've been paying the Morales Freight Company for 2 deliveries they only made 1 of. She turned the relevant invoice to face him across the table. "They charged you twice for the August load." Colter came over and looked at the paper, then at Mabel. "You've been here 2 hours. It was a reasonably organized box, relative to some I've seen." She picked up her coffee. "You should also know that your pasture water calculation for winter is based on an overestimate. I found the source numbers you were using. The creek flow rate document is 4 years old, and the actual current flow is lower than it was when that survey was done." He pulled a chair out and sat down. He had the look of a man who had just been handed more information than he'd expected and was taking a moment to recalibrate. "How much lower?" "Enough that if you add the 6 head you were planning to acquire in December, you'll be short in February." She paused. "But there are 2 adjustments you could make to the feeding schedule that would compensate. I can work them out if you want." "Yeah," he said. I want. He was looking at her differently now. Not the way the crowd in Copper Hollow had looked at her. Not the careful assessing look of people trying to decide how to categorize her. He was looking at her the way she'd occasionally seen people look at a well-made tool with genuine appreciation for what it could do. She found, to her mild surprise, that this didn't embarrass her. It felt appropriate. There's something else in these records, she said, and she heard her own voice change slightly, go quieter, more deliberate. He heard it, too. He stayed where he was, watching her. Your property documents, she said. The ones that describe the north boundary along the creek. What about them? Can I see whatever original filing you have? The one from when you purchased the property from the territorial office. He got up and went to a leather satchel hanging on a peg near the door. He sorted through it for a moment and came back with a folded document that had the look of something that had been opened and refolded many times. He set it in front of her. Mabel smoothed it open carefully on the table. She looked at the boundary descriptions. Then she looked at them again. She reached into the pile of papers she'd organized and extracted an invoice from a local surveying company not addressed to Colter, but one that had somehow found its way into his paperwork, perhaps delivered in error, perhaps not. She set the invoice beside the property document. The surveying invoice was dated 6 weeks ago. It was billed to the Vale Cattle Company. And the boundary coordinates listed on it, the coordinates that she assumes described some piece of Vale property being resurveyed, were very nearly identical to the coordinates in Colter's property filing. Very nearly, but not quite. The ones on the invoice had moved the northern boundary approximately 50 feet south. 50 feet south. Along Ironwater Creek. 50 feet that, if recorded as the actual property line, would place control of the creek access on Vale land instead of Dane land. Mabel sat very still for a moment. The fire in the wood stove ticked and settled. Outside, one of the horses shifted and the corral fence creaked. She thought about a drawer in Garrick Vale's office that had been left slightly open. She thought about the way he'd left her alone with the accounts for 20 minutes to go deal with a ranch hand situation, and whether that had been genuine or engineered. She thought about the surveying invoice she'd seen in that drawer. Only briefly, only a glance, but she had a glance's worth of memory of it that had been sitting in the back of her mind for 3 days trying to tell her something. Now it was telling her very clearly. Colter, she said. Yeah. Who told you the survey invoice got mixed in with your paperwork? He came around the table and looked at it. Nobody told me anything. I didn't know it was there. When did you last go through the box completely? Thought about it. Maybe 2 months back. Why? This invoice is 6 weeks old. She kept her voice careful and even. And I need you to look at something. She showed him both documents side by side. She walked him through the numbers slowly, the way she did with ranchers who weren't comfortable with figures, not condescending, just methodical, making sure each piece was clear before moving to the next. By the time she was finished, Colter Dane was standing with both hands flat on the table and a look on his face that was not anger exactly, but was the precursor to it. The look of a man who has understood something he wished he didn't understand yet. They're moving the boundary, he said. Someone has filed a new survey, Mabel said, or is preparing to. If this invoice is what it appears to be, and I believe it is, then Bram Vale intends to record a property description that places your north bank of Ironwater Creek inside his property line. He can if there's no one to challenge it who's credible. She looked at him steadily. And if the only person who happened to notice the discrepancy between the original survey and the new one had been standing tied to a wagon in Copper Hollow this morning, while a crowd watched and a man in a good coat explained to everyone present that she was a foolish, desperate woman who couldn't be trusted. The fire ticked. The wind moved across the roof. Colter straightened. He stood there for a moment with an expression she was coming to recognize the calculation, the weighing, the unhurried assessment of a situation before deciding what to do with it. So this morning wasn't about the accounts, he said. The accounts were an excuse, Mabel said. I saw the survey invoice in Garrick's office. I didn't say anything about it at the time because I wasn't sure what I was seeing, but I think Garrick realized I'd seen it. She paused. And I think Bram Vale decided that the safest approach was to make sure that if I ever said anything, nobody in Copper Hollow would believe a word of it. A woman with a reputation for being rejected and bitter, Colter said, his voice flat. A large woman with a reputation for being rejected and bitter, Mabel said. She said it without flinching, because flinching was how you let that kind of thing become a wound. In a town where the richest family has been cultivating goodwill for 20 years. My word against Bram Vale's. You can do that arithmetic without my help. Colter was quiet for a moment. He looked at the 2 documents on the table. Then he said very quietly, Do you know where the original survey is? The real one? Mabel thought about the drawer, the way it had been left open. Papers folded inside it. She had one detail, just one, but it was specific. I think it's still in Garrick's office, she said. Kept it. Why would they keep it? She thought about that. It was a fair question. You might expect Bram Vale to destroy an inconvenient document. But the Vale family had not gotten where they were through carelessness. They kept records. They kept things that gave them leverage, that established their version of history, that could be presented or withheld as circumstances required. Because destroying it creates a gap in the record, she said slowly. The original survey simply never existed. That's one kind of problem. But if the original survey exists and says one thing, and the new survey says something different, and you're the one holding both, then you control the story. You can say the original was in error. You can say the surveyor made a correction. She paused. But only if you're the only one who can produce the original. Colter looked at her. Except that now you know it exists. Except that now I know it exists, she agreed. And you know I know it. The evening was beginning to settle against the windows. The light through the one finished pane had gone the deep orange of late afternoon. Mabel realized she had not eaten since before dawn, and that her wrists were more sore than she'd admitted to herself, and that she was sitting at a stranger's table in the middle of a problem that was significantly larger than the one she'd left Copper Hollow with this morning. She looked at her hands on the table. Colter, she said. Yeah. What do you do when someone builds a case against you before you've had a chance to respond to it? He was quiet for a moment. Then you find something they didn't expect you to find. Outside, a horse moved in the corral. The wind had shifted and was coming now from the north, carrying the cold of the upper ridge down across the flat. Mabel nodded slowly. And that's what we do, she said. She said it like a simple thing that's what we do, and Colter Dane looked at her across the rough table with its spread of documents and thought that he had never met a woman quite like this one, and that the Vale family had made a serious error in judgment when they decided the best way to handle Mabel Whitlock was a rope and a freight wagon. He didn't say any of that. He got up and made more coffee instead, because the evening was coming in cold, and they had a great deal of work to do. The first thing Mabel needed was paper. Real paper, not the backs of old invoices, proper ledger paper if he had it, or anything clean that could hold organized columns. Colter found a half-used ledger in the bottom of the hardware crate that had never been opened, still in its brown paper, wrapping from whatever mercantile had sold it. He set it in front of her and she opened it to the first page without ceremony and began to write. She wrote from memory. That was the thing that struck him, watching her from across the room while he worked on the window frame again, hammer in hand but moving quietly so as not to interrupt. She wasn't referring back to the Vale invoice or to his property documents. She was writing straight out of her head, columns of figures and boundary descriptions and dates and names, her handwriting small and precise and completely unhurried, like someone taking dictation from a very reliable source. He set the hammer down after a while and just watched. You're staring, she said, without looking up. I'm observing, he said. There's a distinction. What's the distinction? Staring is impolite. Observing is educational. She made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh that she decided not to finish. She kept writing. When did you first notice the survey discrepancy? Colter asked. He pulled a chair out and sat down at a respectful distance, leaving her the working end of the table. About 40 minutes into reviewing the Vale accounts, she said, I wasn't looking for it. Garrick had asked me to go through the feed and water expenditures for the last 2 seasons. He said his father thought there might be errors in the supply calculations, which was a reasonable thing to ask for, so I didn't think twice. She turned a page and started a new column. The surveying invoice was in the same drawer as the water expense records. He left me alone with the drawer open. She paused. I keep going back and forth on whether that was deliberate. What do you think? I think Garrick Vale is not a careless man. I think the drawer being open was probably intentional. She set the pencil down for a moment and looked at the wall, thinking, but I'm not sure whether he left it open because he wanted me to see it and be frightened, or because he was trying to tell me something without being able to say it directly. Colter considered this. You think he might have wanted you to find the evidence against his own family? I think Garrick and his father are not always in agreement, she said carefully. I've seen them together in town. Bram is the kind of man who makes decisions and expects them to be followed without comment. Garrick does follow them, but there's something underneath that I've always noticed. She searched for the word. Tiredness. Like a man who has been running a race he didn't choose to enter. She picked up the pencil again. That doesn't mean he's a good man, she added. He stood in the square this morning and he said what he said. He let them tie the rope. Her voice didn't change, but something in the air around it did. I'm not making excuses for him. I'm just saying I don't think the situation is as simple as Bram on one side and everyone else on the other. You think there might be room to use that, Colter said. I think there might be, she said. Eventually. But not yet. They worked through the evening. Mabel continued her reconstruction of everything she remembered seeing in the Vale accounts, and Colter, once he understood the purpose, began pulling his own records and feeding her relevant information property descriptions, water access documents, the original filing from the territorial office when he'd acquired the ranch. She cross-referenced each piece against what she held in memory, noting where the versions matched and, more importantly, where they didn't. At some point she stopped and rubbed her eyes with the back of her hand, and he noticed the way she held her wrists slightly bent, like she was keeping the sore parts away from any contact. "Do you have any cloth I could wrap those?" she said. She caught him looking, not badly hurt, just rope burned. He found a strip of cotton flannel in his supply box, and she wrapped her wrists herself, tightly and competently, the way someone does when they've dealt with physical discomfort often enough to not need help with it. He didn't offer to help. He'd learned that much already. "Your father," Colter said, and then stopped, unsure whether he should continue. "What about him?" Mabel said. "It wasn't a question exactly. He was there this morning, in the crowd. Did he know it was going to happen?" Mabel was quiet for a moment. The fire had settled to good steady coals and the room was warm, which was something. "I don't know for certain," she said. "I think he knew something was coming. Bram Vale has been holding my father's debt for 4 years. That's a significant instrument of control." She smoothed the flannel at her wrist. "My father is not a brave man. I've known that my whole life. He's kind in his way. He means well in his way. But when something frightening comes toward him, his first instinct is to make himself small and hope it passes over. And it usually passes over onto someone else, usually onto me," she said. She said it without self-pity, just as a plain accounting of how things had worked out over time. "I don't hate him for it. But I stopped being surprised by it a long time ago." Colter nodded. He thought about his own father briefly, a man of a different kind of failure, and put the thought away again. "You'll need to be careful going back to Copper Hollow," he said. She looked up. "Who said I'm going back to Copper Hollow?" "You'll have to at some point. The evidence is there." "I know that." She looked back at her ledger. "I said I'd be careful. That's the plan." He realized she had already been thinking several steps beyond the current moment. He wasn't sure why that surprised him. She'd demonstrated in the last several hours that this was simply how she operated, but it did, a little. "What do you need from me?" he asked. She thought about it seriously, which he appreciated. She didn't deflect or minimize. "Your property documents. All of them. And I need to know who the Territorial Land Commissioner is, and whether you have any contact there or whether you know anyone who does." "I know the name," he said. "Commissioner Aldrich. I met him once when I filed the property claim. Seemed like a straight man." "Straight men have been known to bend when the right pressure is applied," she said, which was the kind of thing that would have sounded cynical from someone else, and from her sounded simply like experience. "But a straight man who hasn't been leaned on yet is useful. Do you know how to reach him?" "I'd have to ride to the territorial capital." 2-day ride, she made a note. "Not yet. First we need to know what we have, what we can prove." She tapped the pencil against the ledger. "What I remember from the Vale accounts is enough to raise questions. But raising questions isn't enough against the most powerful family in the valley. We need the original survey, which is in Garrick's office." "Which is in Garrick's office," she agreed. "Probably behind the false panel." Colter went still. "How do you know about a false panel?" Mabel glanced at him. "The proportions of the room don't match the outside of the building. The east wall reads about 2 feet shorter from inside than it should be based on the exterior dimensions. I noticed it the first time I was in the office." She paused. "I never had a reason to mention it before." He stared at her for a moment. "Mabel," he said, "yes, that is genuinely remarkable." She looked briefly uncomfortable, which he found interesting. She could take practical acknowledgement without much trouble, but something that was closer to admiration landed differently. She looked back at her work. "It's just geometry," she said. "It's not just geometry. It's geometry and paying attention," she said, firmly, closing the subject. He let it close, but he turned the knowledge over in his mind. She had noticed a discrepancy in wall dimensions during a working visit to a private office, filed it away without comment, and connected it weeks later to the problem of where a man might hide documents he didn't want found. That wasn't just mathematical ability. That was a particular quality of mind that he had encountered perhaps twice in his life, in men who'd been territorial scouts, whose survival had depended on seeing everything and making sense of it. He wondered what Mabel Whitlock might have become in a different arrangement of circumstances, and then he put that thought away too, because it wasn't useful. Circumstances were what they were. The next morning she was up before him. He came out of his bedroom at first light to find the main room already organized, the ledger closed and set aside, the invoice and property documents stacked neatly in a separate pile, the coffee already made and sitting on the iron. She was at the table with a different paper, smaller, and she was writing a list. She was also, he noticed, wearing a different expression than she'd had the night before. Less inward. More forward-facing. I need to look at your horses, she said without preamble. The sorrel is its sound. Mostly. She favors her left front in cold starts but works out of it. Your bay? Reliable, not fast, she nodded. I also need to look at your winter feed situation. The actual situation, not what the old calculation said. If we're going to correct the numbers, I want to see what's actually in the barn, he said. She looked at him steadily. You said you hired me to keep accounts. I'm keeping accounts. All of them. Including the ones that tell you whether you can sustain your herd through February. She lifted her coffee. Unless you'd like me to limit my attention to only the numbers that aren't inconvenient. No, he said. All of them. Good, she took a drink of her coffee. Then let's start with the barn. He was starting to understand that this was how she moved through the world in forward motion, in practical purpose. One problem addressed before the next was considered. He suspected it was something she'd developed deliberately, a way of living in a body and a situation that other people wanted to reduce to a single simple story. Keep moving. Keep being useful. Keep being more than what they decided you were when they first looked at you. The barn was cold and smelled of good hay and horse and the particular dusty warmth that comes from animals spending the night enclosed. The sorrel came forward immediately when Mabel entered, nosing at her coat pocket, and Mabel let the mare smell her hand and then ran a careful palm down the left foreleg, feeling the tendons, watching the animal's ear for any sign of flinching. She's been favoring it longer than the cold, Mabel said. There's some heat around the lower joint. Not bad, but she needs a different feeding arrangement, more time off her feet in the morning before she works. I didn't know you knew horses, my father's horses, since I was 8. She moved to the bay, gave him a brief professional assessment, moved on to the hay storage. She walked the length of the barn measuring with her steps, which Colter watched with interest because she was clearly doing arithmetic in her head as she walked. At the far end, she stopped and stood for a moment. You're about 12% short of what you need for the original plan, she said. But if you pull back acquisition until March instead of December, and adjust the feeding rotation to, she stopped. Do you have a pencil? He found one on the workbench. She wrote on the back of a scrap of board. A feeding rotation adjusted to what she'd seen in the barn, a timeline for acquisition, a rough calculation of shortfall versus adjustment. She handed him the board. He looked at it. I can follow this. Good. She turned to leave and then stopped. She was looking at the north wall of the barn, or rather, out through the barn door in the direction the north wall faced, the direction of Ironwater Creek. How often do you check your north boundary? She asked. When I have a reason to. I haven't had a reason. We should write it, she said. Today. He understood why. If someone was preparing to file a new survey, there was a chance, maybe small, maybe not, that they'd already begun some physical marking of the boundary they intended to claim. Survey stakes or marker stones placed in the wrong position, the preparatory work of making a false line look like an established one. They rode north along the creek after breakfast. The morning was clear and viciously cold, the kind of Wyoming Territory winter morning that had no patience for insufficient clothing, and they were both adequately bundled, which said something about the practical competence of each of them. The roan moved steadily and the bay kept pace, and Mabel rode with the straight-backed economy of someone who had spent enough time on horseback to stop thinking about the mechanics of it. The creek was low, but running a dark thread of water through frost-pale ground, cutting its own small channel through the sedge and frozen mud of the bank. Colter showed her where his property filing described the north boundary, where the original stakes had been set by the previous owner, back when the property was first filed. The stakes were still there, but beside 2 of them, set at careful intervals and partially obscured by the dieback of autumn grass, were new iron markers. Different markers, set approximately 45 feet south of the original stakes. Mabel got down from the bay without speaking. She crouched beside the nearest new marker and examined it without touching it. It was a proper surveyor's stake iron shod, well driven, with a small metal tag attached that bore a number sequence she studied for several seconds before straightening. Vale Property Survey, she said. The number format matches the invoice I saw in Garrick's office. Colter got down beside her. He looked at the original stake, then at the new one. 45 feet of ground, a piece of bank, the edge of a creek. They've already been here, he said. They've been here recently, she said. Within the last 2 weeks, I'd estimate, from the condition of the ground around the stake. She looked down the creek line. How much of your property runs along the north bank? About half a mile. Then there will be more of these. There were. They found 6 in total over the next 40 minutes of riding, each positioned with the same careful offset pulling the claimed boundary south, away from the creek, step by calculated step. It was neat work. Professional. Kind of survey adjustment that, paired with a properly filed document in the territorial office, would look completely legitimate to anyone who hadn't seen the original filing and didn't know where to look for the difference. Mabel noted the position of each stake against landmarks she could describe precisely specific large rocks, a distinctive bend in the creek, a dead cedar with a broken top. She committed each one to memory and added descriptive notes to the small notebook she'd taken from the ledger and tucked into her coat before they rode out. On the way back, she was quiet for a long stretch, which Colter had already learned to read not as discomfort but as active thought. He didn't interrupt it. Finally, she said, "We can't pull the stakes." "I know," he said. "They just reset them, and we'd have demonstrated that we know about them, and given them a reason to move faster." She paused. "What we need is a complete record of where each one is currently positioned, and testimony from someone credible that these markers were not here before a specific date." She glanced at him. "Do you have any neighbors who ride this section of the creek? Anyone who might have noticed?" "Thought about it. The Devereaux family pastures sheep on the next property north. Old Leon Devereaux has been doing it for 15 years. He goes along the creek most weeks. Would he remember when these markers appeared?" "Leon Devereaux remembers everything that changes on land he's been walking since before the territory was organized," Colter said. "He's 70-something and sharp as a new nail. Can we talk to him today?" "I'd need to ride about 3 miles north." "Then let's ride," she said. Leon Devereaux was a wiry man of indeterminate very old age who lived alone in a tight, well-maintained house and whose first response to finding 2 people on horseback in his yard was to stand on his porch with a rifle across his arm and say, without hostility but without any particular warmth either, "What do you need?" Colter introduced himself and Mabel. Leon lowered the rifle to his side and looked at Mabel with the direct, unself-conscious appraisal of a man who had been old long enough to be past caring about social performance. "Whitlock's girl," he said. "That's right," Mabel said. "Heard what happened in town yesterday." "Most people did," she said. "Garrick Vale is a poor excuse for a man," Leon said. This appeared to be a complete and considered judgment, and he didn't elaborate on it. "Come in. It's cold." Inside Leon's house, over coffee that was strong enough to be impolite, Mabel explained what they'd found along the creek, the stakes, the positions, the relationship to the Vale survey invoice. Leon listened without interrupting, his pale eyes moving between Mabel and Colter as they talked, his hands wrapped around his mug. When they finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Those stakes weren't there on the 14th, he said. "I went along that stretch on the 14th, checking the ice on the crossing. Nothing there but the original posts. I've been looking at those posts for 8 years. "You're certain?" Mabel asked. "I'm not in the habit of being uncertain about what I see on land I walk regularly," Leon said. "I'm certain." "Would you be willing to say that officially?" "In front of the land commissioner, if it came to that." Leon looked at her steadily. "Girl, I have been watching Bram Vale slowly squeeze this valley for 6 years. If someone has finally found the piece of paper that stops him, I will ride to the territorial capital in a snowstorm to say what I know." He set his mug down with a careful, deliberate motion. "The question is whether you've got that piece of paper or—" "Not yet," Mabel said. Leon nodded slowly. "Then you'd better get it before they know you're looking." The ride back to Colter's ranch was faster, the horses moving well in the cold and both of them with their thoughts occupied. The sky had gone the particular heavy gray of a Wyoming afternoon, considering whether to do something about the weather, and the wind along the creek ridge was sharper than it had been that morning. "We have the stakes," Colter said. "We have Leon's testimony. We have what you reconstructed from memory." He paused. "Is that enough?" Mabel thought about it honestly. "It's enough to open an inquiry," she said. "Probably not enough to win one. Not against what Bram Vale can bring in terms of legal resources and territorial influence." She pulled her coat tighter. "We need the original survey. What I remember from seeing it in that drawer and what we can prove with the document in hand are 2 different things. So we need to get into Garrick's office. Someone does." He looked at her. "What are you not saying?" She was quiet for a moment. "I got a message this morning," she said, "before you were up. Your nearest neighbor to the south, Perkins. Is that his name? He rode by early and left something stuck in the barn door." "Perkins is Vale adjacent," Colter said carefully. "His wife's brother works Vale cattle." "I know." She reached into her coat and produced a folded piece of paper. She handed it across without looking at him, watching the road ahead. "Read it." He unfolded it one-handed, managing the reins with the other, and read the brief note inside. It was in Garrick Vale's handwriting. He'd seen it on documents before, formal and slightly cramped. The note said only, "The document you're looking for is behind the east panel. I'll make sure the office is unattended Thursday between 2 and 4 o'clock. Don't involve my father's men. Come alone or don't come at all." G.V. Colter read it twice. Then he folded it and held it out to her, and she took it back. "Thursday is tomorrow," he said. "Yes, and you believe this." Mabel took a breath. "I believe that Garrick Vale is a man who has been making decisions he doesn't fully agree with for long enough, that some part of him is looking for a way out of them that doesn't require him to be directly." Courageous. She tucked the note back into her coat. That's a specific kind of cowardice that sometimes accidentally does the right thing. Or it's a trap, Colter said. It could be a trap, she agreed. If I go in there and Bram Vale's men are waiting, then I've walked into it, and they have exactly the situation. They want a woman who broke into a private ranch office, who can be dealt with however they choose. She looked at him with clear, direct eyes. If I don't go, we wait until they file that fraudulent survey and the window closes. I'll go, Colter said immediately. You can't, she said. You have to ride to the territorial capital. We need to be in two places at the same time, and you're the one the commissioner knows by name. I'm not sending you into a Vale Ranch building alone based on a note that might be a trap. You're not sending me anywhere, she said quietly. I'm going or not going based on my own assessment of the risk. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Your father is in Copper Hollow, Colter said finally. She turned that over. What are you suggesting? If you're going into that office, you shouldn't be the only person outside who knows where you are. Someone in Copper Hollow who can. He stopped. Even someone who couldn't do much, but who could raise a sound if you don't come back out in a reasonable time. She was very quiet for a long time. The horses moved on. The gray sky held its weather in reserve. My father knows that office, she said at last. He's been to the Vale Ranch many times over the debt negotiations. He knows the building layout. He knows which hands answer to Bram and which are more loosely attached. She paused. He owes me something. He owes you considerably more than something, Colter said. Yes, she said, he does, but I'll start with this. She rode the rest of the way in silence, and Colter didn't press her. He watched the ridge and the creek line and the gray sky and thought about the particular arithmetic of a woman deciding how much she was willing to ask from a father who had let her down in ways that didn't reduce to numbers. That night she wrote a letter to Thomas Whitlock. She didn't ask him to read it aloud. She wrote what she needed and said what it was for and told him where she would be on Thursday between 2 and 4, and she left it open on the table so she could read it over in the morning. She read it over twice and she didn't change a word. She sealed it and gave it to Colter, who would take it south to where the Copper Hollow Road began and find a way to get it to Thomas without the Vale Ranch hands, who occasionally watched the road, being the wiser. If I'm wrong about Garrick, she said, handing over the sealed letter, and it is a trap, then I'll know to come directly back instead of riding to the capital, Colter said. No, her voice was very firm. If something goes wrong, you ride to the capital. You stop the filing. The water matters more than one person's situation. He looked at her for a long moment. He wanted to argue with her. The reasonable, practical part of him understood she was right. The other part, a part he hadn't known, was there until approximately yesterday morning, in a town square with a rope in a freight wagon, disagreed with a force that surprised him. All right, he said. He said it because she was right, not because he felt right about it. She nodded. She folded her hands around her coffee and looked at the fire. I'm not afraid, she said, to the fire rather than to him. And he heard in it the particular quality of a statement that is 90% true and says itself out loud to reinforce the remaining 10. I know, he said. You'd be smarter to be a little afraid. She glanced at him sideways. I said not afraid, she said. I didn't say not paying attention. He laughed. It came out unexpectedly, and she looked briefly startled, and then something loosened around her eyes, and she almost laughed too. And for a moment, the fire was just a fire, and the coffee was just coffee, and they were two people sitting at a table at the end of a very long day. Then she set her cup down and pulled the ledger back toward her and began to write, and the moment folded itself back into the work, which was where both of them were more comfortable anyway. Outside the window, the Wyoming sky had finally made its decision. The first snow of the season was coming down quiet and steady, and committed, covering the creek and the false survey stakes and the frozen ground of the north pasture in something that looked, from inside the warmth of a lamplit room, almost like peace. The snow that had fallen overnight was still on the ground Wednesday morning, not deep, maybe 2 inches, but enough to change the look of everything and make the false survey stakes along the North Creek bank invisible under a clean white surface that didn't know or care what was hidden beneath it. Mabel stood at the barn door with her coffee and looked at the north pasture and thought about Thursday. She had slept, which surprised her. Not well, she'd woken twice in the dark with the specific alertness of someone whose mind had kept working while the rest of her rested, but she had slept, which was more than she'd expected, given everything that was sitting on the other side of tomorrow afternoon. She had lain in the spare room on the bed frame Colter had mentioned, with a proper mattress that turned out to have been added at some point without commentary, and she had gone through the plan in her mind the way she went through a column of figures, methodically, looking for errors, checking each step against the one before it. The plan had errors. She knew that. Any plan that depended on another person behaving a specific way had errors built into it, because people were not arithmetic. Garrick Vale's note said Thursday between 2 and 4. The note might be genuine. The note might be a trap. The note might be genuine, but Garrick's ability to actually clear the office for 2 hours might fail due to factors he couldn't control and didn't anticipate. There were too many variables she couldn't account for. But the original survey was behind the east wall of that office. She was as certain of that as she was of anything, and certainty, in her experience, was worth acting on, even when the circumstances around it were uncertain. Colter came out of the house behind her. He stood beside her and looked at the same pasture and didn't say good morning, which she appreciated. Some people required verbal acknowledgement of a new day before they could function in it. Neither of them appeared to be that kind of person. "Letter get sent?" she asked. "Perkins took it south at first light," he said. "His wife's brother works Vale cattle, not Perkins himself. He's got no particular loyalty to Bram." He paused. "He also doesn't know what's in the envelope." "Good, she drank her coffee. When are you leaving?" "After I'm sure you've got what you need here." He looked at her sideways. "Don't argue with that." She didn't argue with it. "I need to borrow the bay." "Take her." "I'll need to know the back approach to the Vale Ranch. The way that doesn't come past their main gate. There's a stock trail that comes around from the east through a dry wash. I used it once when I was still getting to know the land. It brings you out behind the equipment barn about 200 feet from the main house." He paused. "You'd be visible for those 200 feet, but not from the road." "Not from the road." She nodded and filed it. "What's the office location relative to the main house?" "Ground floor, east side. Single window facing the equipment barn. Door opens into the main hall." She turned to look at him. "You know the Vale Ranch layout." "I filed a water access complaint with Bram's office 2 months after I arrived," he said. "Before I understood exactly what I was dealing with. He invited me in to discuss it." A pause with a dry quality to it. The discussion was short. "What did he say?" "He said the creek access would sort itself out in time and offered me a price on some equipment he wanted to sell." Colter looked at his coffee. "I understood it as a message about how the valley worked and went home. And now you understand it differently." "Now I understand what sorting itself out in time meant." His jaw was tight for a moment, then it released. "Single window, east side door to the main hall." "The false panel you said east wall, based on the proportions." "Roughly in the center, I'd estimate, based on where the exterior and interior measurements didn't match." She looked at the horizon. "I won't know exactly until I'm standing in the room." "You've been in the room twice," he said. "Twice. The first time for about 40 minutes. The second time for 20, which is when I saw the invoice." She closed her eyes briefly, not because she needed to, but because it helped. The way closing your eyes helps you hear something more clearly. "There's a bookcase on the east wall, floor to ceiling. 3 sections. The center section has books on the upper shelves and a closed cabinet on the lower half with a simple latch." She opened her eyes. "If I were hiding a panel, I'd put it behind the closed cabinet. The latch is decorative, too easy for the actual contents. There's something else holding it." Colter was watching her with that expression again, the one that was appreciation without being condescension, which was rarer than it should have been. "I'll find it," she said before he could say anything about the expression on his face. "I know you will," he said. They spent the morning going through the last of what she needed to organize her full reconstruction written out cleanly in the ledger. The creek stake positions described in enough detail to be located by someone who hadn't seen them, Leon Devereaux's contact information and a summary of what he'd told them, and a copy of the relevant sections of Colter's property filing with the discrepant measurements clearly marked. She made 2 copies of everything. One for Colter to take to the territorial capital. One she kept. "If the original survey is what I think it is," she said, setting the second copy in a flat leather case she'd found in the barn, "then what you're bringing Commissioner Aldrich is enough to open an investigation and freeze any new filing temporarily. That buys time." "How much time enough if we move quickly?" She closed the case. "The commissioner can issue a hold on new property filings while a dispute is reviewed. It's not permanent. Vale's attorney will challenge it, but it stops the clock. And if the original survey isn't there, or if the note is a trap and you don't get into the office." Mabel looked at the case in her hands for a moment. "Then we're fighting with what we have," she said. "Which is significant but not decisive." She looked up. "So let's try to get the document." Colter left after midday. He had supplies packed and the roan ready, and he stood in the yard for a moment before he mounted, looking at her with the directness she'd noticed was characteristic of him. He didn't look at things sideways when he had something to say. "Mabel," he said. "I'll be careful," she said. "I know you will." He put his foot in the stirrup. "That's not what I was going to say." She waited. "What I was going to say," he said, settling into the saddle, "is that whatever happens in that office tomorrow, you've already done something that most people in this valley haven't had the nerve to do. I want you to know I understand that." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about several possible responses and dismissed most of them. "Ride fast," she said finally. He touched the brim of his hat, and turned the roan north, toward the road that would take him to the territorial capital, and she watched him go until the distance made him small, and then she went back inside and got to work on the sorrel's leg wraps, because the mare's joint was still warm, and the cold night ahead wasn't going to help it, and there was always something useful to do if you were willing to look for it. Thursday morning arrived without ceremony. The sky was clear and pitilessly cold, the kind of blue that looks beautiful from inside a warm room and will kill you if you treat it carelessly. Mabel ate a proper breakfast oatmeal with dried apple coffee, a piece of cold cornbread from what Colter had left, because she had learned a long time ago that the body needs to be adequately provisioned before it can be asked to do something difficult, and she intended to ask quite a lot of hers today. She dressed in her warmest practical clothes, dark wool coat, good boots, her hair pinned back tightly under a hat. She put the small notebook in her inside coat pocket. She thought about bringing anything else and decided against it. Anything she brought into that office that she didn't come out with would be evidence of something she didn't want to leave evidence of. She brought the leather case with her copies of the documents, saddled the bay, and rode south toward Copper Hollow. The stock trail Colter had described came off the main road about a mile east of the Vale Ranch Gate, angling through dry ground and bare winter scrub before it dropped into the wash and followed the cut of it westward behind the property. She took it slow not because she was hesitant, but because the trail was narrow and partially snow-covered, and the bay was sure-footed but deserved a thoughtful rider. She reached the back edge of the Vale property at 1:15. From the dry wash she could see the rear of the equipment barn, and beyond it, at the distance Colter had estimated, the back wall of the main house, the east side with its single window. The window was dark. She couldn't tell from this distance whether the room was empty or simply unlit. She sat on the bay and waited. A quarter hour passed. Cold worked its way through her coat's outer layer, which was what cold does when you stop moving, but she stayed still and watched the window and the yard between her and it. At 1:30, she saw a figure come out of the main house side door and walk toward the equipment barn without looking back. A young man, one of the house staff, from the look of his clothes. He went into the barn and didn't come out in the time she watched. At 1:45, a second figure appeared, older, moving with the deliberate speed of someone who has somewhere specific to be and has arranged to be there. She recognized the ranch clerk, a man named Alderman, who had been at the desk outside Garrick's office on both her previous visits, heading away from the main house toward the bunkhouse cluster on the far side of the property. That was Garrick's doing. She could see the arrangement of it, the small orchestrations, the reasons given to each person to be somewhere else for a defined period. At 2 o'clock precisely, she rode across the open 200 feet to the back of the main house. She tied the bay at the back hitching post, which was out of sight from the road, and went in through the side door. The hall was empty. It smelled of wood smoke and leather oil and the particular indoor smell of a well-kept working house. She moved quickly, but without running in a hallway, makes noise and draws attention in a way that purposeful walking doesn't. She knew where the office was. She went directly to it. The door was unlocked. She opened it and went in and pulled it mostly closed behind her. The office was empty. She stood for a moment and let her breathing settle. It had gone slightly faster than normal on the walk down the hall. It was honest, and she acknowledged it, and then she looked at the room with the focused attention she'd been holding in reserve since she'd stood at the barn door that morning. Everything was where she remembered: the desk, the window, the bookcase along the east wall in 3 sections, the center section with its decorative cabinet below, the books above it arranged in the order she remembered, which confirmed that no one had gone through them recently enough to disturb them. She went to the cabinet. The latch was exactly as she'd described it to Colter, simple, decorative, the kind that swings open with a finger. She opened it. Inside were ledger books stacked neatly. She moved them carefully aside and set them on the floor in the order she removed them, so she could replace them exactly. Behind where the ledgers had been, the back wall of the cabinet was solid wood paneling. She pressed it at the left edge, then the right. Then she felt along the top edge with 2 fingers, pressing gently, looking for the catch. It was at the right side, top corner, about a finger width from where the panel met the cabinet frame. A small brass mechanism, worn smooth from use. She pressed it and something gave with a quiet click, and the panel swung inward on a simple hinge. The space behind it was maybe 10 inches deep. It held a flat wooden box with a sliding lid, and on top of the box, folded once, was a sheet of cream-colored paper that was visibly older than its surroundings. Her hands were steady when she took it out. She had to tell herself to be slow, because the impulse was to unfold it immediately and verify. But quick movements in an office you're not supposed to be in are how things get dropped and damaged and left behind. She unfolded it carefully. It was the original survey. She knew it at once: the format, the boundary descriptions, the date stamp from the Territorial Surveying Office, the measurements that matched what she remembered seeing in that brief glance in this same room weeks ago. The northern boundary of the Dane property ran along the actual bank of Ironwater Creek, not 50 feet south, not 45 feet south. The actual bank, which was what the property filing had always said and what the New Vale survey was designed to silently contradict. She also looked at the wooden box. She opened the sliding lid. Inside were more documents, folded letters, several pages of accounts that weren't anything like the official ledgers she'd reviewed, and a single page that she recognized within 2 seconds of unfolding it as something she hadn't expected. A signed agreement between Bram Vale and a man named Colter, who ran the freight operation through Copper Hollow, establishing a scheme by which Colter would overreport weight on cattle shipments and split the additional fees with Vale at the direct expense of smaller ranchers who were sharing freight costs without knowing. They were being charged for weight that wasn't there. She stood very still for a moment. This was not just the creek. This was years of it. Different ranchers, different schemes, the same architecture, the most powerful family in the valley quietly extracting money and land and water from everyone around them through mechanisms small enough not to be noticed individually. She needed more time. She didn't have more time. She made a decision she had approximately 15 seconds to make. She folded the original survey and placed it inside her coat, against her body, beneath 2 layers of wool. She could not take the box. The box was too large, and its absence would be immediately obvious. But the survey was what they needed most, and the accounts page with the Colter agreement, she folded that too, carefully, and added it to her coat. She replaced the ledger books in the cabinet in exact order. She closed the false panel until it clicked. She closed the cabinet latch. She stood up. The door opened. Garrick Vale stood in the doorway. He was wearing his riding coat, not the good wool one, the working one, which meant he'd come in from outside. He looked at her with an expression that was not surprise. He had known she was here. He had known because he had arranged for her to be here. For one long second, neither of them moved. Then Garrick looked at the cabinet. The ledgers were exactly where they'd been. The latch was closed. He looked at the front of her coat, which revealed nothing because she had been careful, and because wool is unforgiving of nothing. "Did you find it?" he asked. She looked at him. "Find what?" His jaw moved. "Mabel, I need to know if you found it." "You need to know a lot of things," she said, "including how long you have before whoever your father sent to watch this office gets back." Something shifted in his face. "Alderman is the one I sent away." "He'll be back in." He stopped. "My father didn't send anyone." "You sure?" The color in his face changed slightly. "Sure. Not entirely." "How long do we have?" she asked, because the uncertainty in his expression told her she was right to ask. "I don't know," he said, which was honest, and she gave him credit for it. 20 minutes, maybe less. "Then say what you came to say." He stepped inside and pulled the door almost closed. He was a tall man. She'd always known that. But in the smaller space of the closed office, he seemed to take up more room than he did in her memory of him. He looked tired. Not the tiredness of a person who hasn't slept, the deeper kind, the kind that comes from years of a particular activity you've long stopped being able to justify to yourself. "I didn't know about the wagon," he said. "I want you to know that. Not that it changes anything, but I didn't know that was what my father intended. I thought he was going to, I don't know, file a complaint, threaten your father's debt, something that could be managed." He stopped. "When I came into town and saw the rope, I couldn't." "You stayed," she said. "I stayed." He didn't try to explain it. "I was wrong to stay," she said. "Simple and complete. You were." "I'm trying to fix it," he said. "You're trying to fix it in a way that costs you as little as possible," she said. "Which I understand. But I want you to be clear with yourself about what you're actually doing here." She looked at him steadily. "You're not in this room because your conscience finally overcame your self-interest. You're in this room because you've calculated that the situation has developed to a point where being on the losing side of it is more expensive than what it costs you to switch." He was quiet for a moment. Then quietly, "That's probably true." "Probably," she said. "But that calculation, even if it's self-serving, might still end up being the right thing." So she held his gaze. "What else is in the box?" He blinked. "You looked in the box." "I looked in the box." He sat down in the chair behind the desk as if his legs had made the decision without consulting him. He put both hands flat on the desk surface and stared at them. "The freight arrangement with Colter has been running for 4 years," he said. "It affects 11 families that I know of. The overweighted shipments cost them." He did the arithmetic in his head visibly. Combined probably $800 over 4 years. Maybe more. $800. In a valley where a hard winter could break a small rancher on a shortfall of 40. "Your father's arrangement." "My father's arrangement." A pause. "I knew about it. I didn't participate directly, but I knew." "And the property boundary scheme. That was more recent. The last 18 months. He looked up. "I drew the survey coordinates myself." My father dictated them. A pause. I'm a decent surveyor. It was useful to him. How many properties? Yours was the first. He looked back at his hands. Colter Dane's, I mean. You were supposed to be Mabel. You were supposed to be disgraced enough that if Dane brought a complaint, you could be called as the source and dismissed. He said it flatly, laying it out without trying to soften it. My father is very good at finding the lever. He found yours. She stood very still and let that information settle into its proper place inside her. It wasn't new information. Exactly, she had understood the architecture of it since sitting at Colter's table 2 nights ago. But there was a difference between understanding a thing in the abstract and hearing it confirmed in a closed room by the man who had drawn the false survey coordinates while his father watched. There are other properties, she said. It wasn't a question. 2 more he was looking at, Garrick said. The Mullen place south of the creek and a water easement that the Harker brothers hold that he wants to convert to full ownership. He paused. He wasn't planning to stop at the Dane ranch. Of course he wasn't. Mabel thought of Leon Devereaux going along the creek with his sheep every week for 15 years, watching the land change around him by increments. She thought of the families whose cattle weights had been misrecorded for 4 years, quietly losing money they couldn't account for. Garrick, she said. He looked at her. Will you testify? The silence that followed that question had a particular weight. She watched him work through it, not the immediate reaction, which she could see cross his face and be suppressed, but the deeper calculation. What it would cost him. What his father would do, what the valley would look like on the other side of a public proceeding in which Garrick Vale testified against Bram Vale. He's my father, he said finally. I know that. He stopped. Started again. He built everything we have, some of it badly. But he built it. Some of it on other people's backs, she said, not harshly. Yes, I know that too, and I know that doesn't make the question easier. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she began to measure the remaining minutes against the time it would take Alderman to walk back from the bunkhouse cluster. I sent the note, Garrick said. I cleared the office. I sat here last night and I thought about what happens if nobody stops him, and he put his hand over his face briefly and then removed it. 2 more properties. The Mullen family has children. Small ones. She waited. Yes, he said, I'll testify. She breathed out. Then when this comes to a hearing, you need to be prepared for what your father will do. He'll say I'm lying, Garrick said. He'll say I had a personal grievance. He'll find something. He'll try to use the same mechanism on you that he used on me, she said. Make you look unreliable before you can speak. You need to know that going in. She paused. But you won't be alone. Leon Devereaux will testify. The Mullen family and the Harkers may testify when they understand what was done to their accounts. And Colter Dane is at the territorial capital right now presenting a documented challenge to your father's survey filing. Garrick looked up. He's already there? He left yesterday afternoon. Something moved across Garrick's face that she couldn't entirely categorize. It might have been relief. It might have been the feeling of a thing already set in motion that you can no longer stop, which is different from relief, but sometimes looks similar from the outside. My father is going to know, he said. When the commissioner's office contacts his attorney, I know. She moved toward the door. How long do you need to put distance between yourself and this ranch before he finds out? Garrick looked at her with something like genuine surprise. Like he hadn't expected her to think about his safety. A day, he said. Maybe. Then I'd suggest you find a reason to be somewhere other than here by tomorrow morning. She put her hand on the door. Don't tell me where, Mabel. His voice stopped her. Turned. He was still sitting at the desk with his hands flat on the surface, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had done wrong things for years, for reasons he understood too well, now sitting on the other side of a door he'd opened and couldn't close. For the square, for the rope, for all of it. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. It's not enough, but it's a start. She opened the door and went out. The halls was still empty. She walked it at the same deliberate pace she'd used, coming in purposeful but unhurried, the walk of a person who belongs in a space, and went out through the side door into the cold. The bay was at the hitching post. She untied the reins with hands that were steady and only slightly cold, mounted, and rode back through the 200 feet of open yard to the cover of the equipment barn without hurrying. She reached the dry wash and turned east before she let herself breathe fully. The documents were still against her body, warm from the temperature of her skin. She could feel the folded edge of the survey through 2 layers of wool, a small, hard pressure against her ribs that was more reassuring than any gun she'd ever held. She had it. She turned the bay south toward Copper Hollow, because there was still one more thing that needed to happen before she rode for the territorial capital, and it was the thing she had been turning over in her mind since the night she'd written the letter to her father, since the night she'd read it twice and not changed a word. She needed Thomas Whitlock, not because she forgave him. She was not there yet, and she was honest enough with herself not to pretend she was. She needed him because the plan required it, because he was the person who could move through Copper Hollow without drawing the kind of attention she would draw, and because at some point a man who had remained silent when his daughter was tied to a wagon needed to be given the chance to do something different. Whether he would take it was a calculation she couldn't make for him. Town came into view around the bend of the South Road in the low gold of a winter afternoon, the scattered buildings of Copper Hollow sitting in the cold with their smoke columns rising straight up in the still air, looking exactly as they had looked every day of her life. The feed store with its sign, the square where the wagon had been. She didn't look at the square directly as she rode past it. There wasn't anything there to see the wagon had apparently been moved to somewhere out of sight, but she didn't look anyway. Her father's house was at the east end of the road, a small structure with a kitchen garden that was brown and frozen now, a woodpile that was lower than it should be for this point in winter. She saw that without deciding to see it. She saw everything. She tied the bay at the fence post and knocked on the door, which she had not done in 24 years of having a key. Thomas Whitlock opened the door. He looked at her. He was wearing his indoor coat over his shirt, and his hair was not combed, which meant he'd been sitting rather than working. He had dark circles under his eyes. He had, she thought, looked worse in the last 2 days than she had ever seen him look. Told her the letter had landed. "Mabel," he said. "Can I come in?" she said. It was not entirely a question. He stepped back and let her in. The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and the particular accumulated smell of a person living alone. She sat down at the table, not the chair she usually used when she lived here, but the other one, the one across from it, which put her where she could see the door. He sat across from her and folded his hands on the table and looked at them. "I got your letter," he said. "I know. I've been sitting here since yesterday thinking about." He stopped. His voice had a rough quality she wasn't used to. "I've been sitting here trying to find a way to tell you I'm sorry that is worth the air it takes to say it." She looked at her father's hands. They were old hands, a working man's hands, but they had been shaking slightly for the last couple of years, and she had noticed that without saying anything because that was how she dealt with things she couldn't fix. "I need your help," she said. He looked up. "Not because I'm over what happened," she said. "I'm not. And I won't tell you I am because you don't deserve that, and frankly, neither do I." She held his gaze steadily. "But I need your help because you are in a position to do something I can't do from where I'm standing, and because several families in this valley need this to go right, and because you know the Vale property and the people in this town in ways that are useful." His jaw worked. "What do you need?" she told him. She told him about Colter at the territorial capital, about Garrick and the testimony he'd agreed to provide, about the document she was carrying, about what the commissioner's hearing would need in terms of local witnesses who could speak to the patterns of what Bram Vale had done to the valley's smaller ranchers. She told him about the freight arrangement with Cutter and the $800 spread across 11 families over 4 years. She watched his face as she told him that part. She watched him understand what had been happening to people he had sat across from, eaten meals with, known his whole life in this small settlement. "I knew something was wrong with the freight weights," he said quietly. He stopped. "I told myself I'd miscounted." "Probably didn't miscount," she said. "No." He was quiet. "Probably not." "Will you go to the families you know?" she said. "The ones who might have noticed the same thing and talked themselves out of it the same way you did. Will you tell them what's happening and ask them to consider coming forward?" It was a large thing to ask. She understood that. Thomas Whitlock was not a man who liked to be in the front of a difficult situation. She was asking him to go to his neighbors and explain that they had been robbed, and that the person who had robbed them was the most powerful man in the valley, and that they needed to stand up and say so in an official proceeding. He would be making himself a target. He understood that, too. She could see him understanding it. "Bram Vale holds my debt," he said. "I know." "If the hearing goes the way I believe it will," Mabel said, "Bram Vale is not going to be in a position to hold anyone's debt much longer." She paused. "But I can't promise you that. I can only tell you what I believe and what I have and let you make your own decision." Her father looked at her for a long time. She had her mother's eyes. People had always said that. And her mother had been gone for 9 years. And Thomas Whitlock looked at his daughter across his own kitchen table and saw in her something he had known was there and had not found a way, in 61 years of living, to match. "I'll go to the Mullins tonight," he said, "and the Harkers tomorrow morning." He paused. "I know 2 other families who complained about the freight weights privately. I'll talk to them." She nodded. She started to stand. "Mabel," he said. She stopped. He couldn't finish it. There were too many ends to that sentence, and none of them were adequate. She could see that on his face the specific anguish of a man confronting a failure so complete that the apology for it can't be contained in language. "I know," she said. "We'll talk about it properly when this is finished." She picked up her hat. "Right now there's too much else to do." She went out. She untied the bay from the fence post and mounted and turned north out of Copper Hollow. The territorial capital was 2 days' ride. She had the original survey against her ribs and the cold air of a Wyoming Territory winter in her face and a bay horse under her who was willing and sensible, and she rode hard into the lowering afternoon with the particular feeling of a person who has set a thing in motion that is now larger than any single hand could hold and is moving under its own weight toward wherever it is going to land. The road north was empty. The sky above the ridge was the deep winter blue of late afternoon going to evening, and the first stars were beginning to appear at the eastern edge of it, faint and cold and very far away. She rode toward them anyway. She rode through the first night until the bay told her, through the subtle language of a tiring horse, that they needed to stop. Not a dramatic signal, just a slight heaviness in the stride, a reluctance at an uphill section that the mare had taken easily 3 hours earlier. Mabel pulled up at a shallow creek crossing where the water ran clear under a skim of ice at the edges, let the bay drink and rest, wrapped herself in the blanket from the saddlebag, and sat against a rock for 2 hours with the document still inside her coat. She didn't sleep. She wasn't sure she could have, and she didn't try particularly hard. She sat and listened to the night sounds of the territory wind and scrub, the bay moving quietly at the end of her tide reins. Somewhere distant, the sound of something that might have been a coyote, or might have been the wind finding a particular gap in the rocks, and she thought about the hearing. She had never been inside a territorial land commissioner's office. She had never testified in any official proceeding. She had reviewed documents for ranchers who were involved in disputes, had helped them understand what they were looking at, had occasionally written out clear summaries of account discrepancies that they could take to someone with official standing. But she had always been the person behind the person who walked through the door. Tomorrow she would be walking through the door herself. She thought about that honestly, the way she thought about everything without flinching from the hard parts. 24-year-old woman from a small settlement, heavy-set, unmarried, arriving dusty from 2 days on the road to contradict the land claim of the most established cattle baron in the valley. She knew exactly how that looked to people who didn't know her, and she had enough experience with people who didn't know her to understand that appearances had weight in official rooms just as much as they did in town squares. She had the documents. That was the difference. That was what she held onto through the cold 2 hours against the rock while the bay rested and the night moved around her. She remounted before first light and rode the second day hard. Territorial capital was a real town significantly larger than Copper Hollow, with proper streets and a stone building that housed the commissioner's office alongside several other territorial administrative functions. She arrived in the late afternoon of the second day, stiff and trail-worn, and aware that she looked exactly as someone looks after 2 days on horseback in Wyoming Territory winter, which is to say not impressive by any conventional measure. She found the land commissioner's office on the building's second floor. A young clerk at a desk near the door looked up when she came in and took in her appearance with the professional neutrality of someone who sees a wide range of people in the course of territorial administrative work. "I need to see Commissioner Aldrich," she said. "The commissioner is in a hearing," the clerk said. "If you'd like to leave your name, my name is Mabel Whitlock. I have documentation relevant to a property dispute involving the Vale Cattle Company and the Dane Ranch property." She set the leather case on the clerk's desk the copy she'd made, not the original. "I also have an original survey document that directly contradicts a new filing I believe is currently under review." Kept her voice level and precise. The voice she used when she was doing accounts for ranchers who were nervous and needed to understand that the person reading their numbers knew what they were doing. "I understand the commissioner is occupied, but if someone in that hearing room is currently attempting to have a fraudulent property claim approved, then the timing of this conversation is material." Clerk looked at the case, looked at her, made a decision. "Wait here," he said, and went through the inner door. She stood in the outer office and did not sit down, because sitting down in that moment would have required more composure than remaining upright. She kept her hands still at her sides and her breathing even, and she waited. The inner door opened in less than 3 minutes. Colter Dane came through it first, and the expression on his face when he saw her was something she filed away for later relief and something else, something she didn't have a precise name for, that moved across his face in the moment before he controlled it. "You made it," he said. "I made it," she said. "Is the hearing still running?" "Bram's attorney has been presenting the new survey filing for the last hour," he said, lowering his voice. "Aldrich put a provisional hold on it when I arrived yesterday and showed him the documented discrepancies, but Vale's attorney has been arguing that the hold should be lifted because the new survey supersedes the original." He glanced at the inner door. "Aldrich is straight, but he's careful. He doesn't want to make a ruling that gets overturned." "He won't have to be careful if he has the original in front of him," she said. Colter looked at the front of her coat. Understanding crossed his face. You have it. I have it. He let out a breath that was slow and controlled and told her he had been carrying more tension about this than he'd shown in the last 2 days. Okay, he said. Come in. The hearing room was a plain, functional space, a long table, several chairs, a window that looked out over the street below. Commissioner Aldrich sat at the head of the table, a compact man in his 60s with a methodical face and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. To his right sat a man she didn't recognize, but whose quality of clothing and the precision of the documents stacked before him identified him clearly as a professional attorney, Bram Vale's attorney. Bram Vale himself was in the room. She had seen him at a distance before, but never this close, never in a contained space. He was a large man, broad across the chest and shoulders, with white hair and a deeply lined face that had the look of a man who had spent real years in real weather and come through it largely intact. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his posture absolutely contained, and when Mabel walked in, he looked at her with an expression of such complete, unhurried contempt that she felt it like a temperature change in the room. He had not expected her. She could see it, the tiny adjustment behind his eyes, the recalculation, the same process she'd seen in Garrick's face in the square the morning of the wagon, which told her that whatever Bram Vale knew about the last several days, he had not known she would be here in this room today. That was information. She kept it. Commissioner Aldrich, she said, addressing him directly and not looking at Vale again. My name is Mabel Whitlock. I'm a bookkeeper from Copper Hollow with direct experience reviewing accounts and documents related to the Vale Cattle Company. I understand you're reviewing a survey filing that affects the northern boundary of the Dane property along Ironwater Creek. Aldrich studied her over his glasses. That's correct. And you are here because I have the original survey, she said. She reached inside her coat and withdrew the folded document. She crossed the room and placed it on the table in front of Aldrich. This is the original boundary survey of the Dane property, filed with the Territorial Surveying Office. I'd ask you to compare the northern boundary coordinates with those in the Vale Company's new filing. The attorney started to speak. Aldrich held up one hand without looking away from the document he was now unfolding with careful hands. The room was very quiet. Aldrich read. He read the original slowly, running one finger along the coordinate descriptions. Then he picked up the new Vale filing and read it. Then he set both documents side by side and looked at them together. These boundary coordinates are not the same, he said. Not an accusation yet, an observation, delivered with the specific care of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at, but wanted to be certain before he said anything that couldn't be taken back. They are not, Mabel said. The attorney leaned forward. Commissioner, this woman arrived here without any established standing in this proceeding, and with a document whose provenance is entirely. Where did this document come from? Aldrich asked Mabel. Direct, not hostile. From behind a false panel in the private office of the Vale Ranch, she said. I recovered it yesterday afternoon. You entered private property. I was provided access, she said, which was technically true in the specific sense that a key had not been required. She kept her voice even. The document was concealed, Commissioner, in a location that would not have been found during any routine examination of the office. Coordinates on the original survey established the Dane property's northern boundary at the actual bank of Ironwater Creek. Coordinates on the Vale Company's new filing moved that boundary 50 feet south, which would transfer creek access from the Dane property to Vale land. Bram Vale spoke for the first time. His voice was large and controlled and entirely unsurprised, which told her he had decided in the last 2 minutes how he was going to handle this. Commissioner, what you are looking at is a woman who was publicly identified 3 days ago in Copper Hollow as having stolen documents from my family's office. She has now apparently entered that office again and removed additional materials. This is not evidence of fraud. This is evidence of a continued pattern of behavior by a person with a documented grudge against my family. Aldrich looked at him. The public identification you're describing, what was the nature of it? A slight pause. The first one, a complaint filed with the local sheriff regarding missing account documents. The nature of the complaint was a public accusation, Mabel said, made in the town square, with the complainant bound with rope to a freight wagon while residents watched. Commissioner, if you'd like verification of that, the sheriff of Copper Hollow can confirm it, as can approximately 50 witnesses. Something shifted in the room's quality. Not dramatically, Aldrich was not a dramatic man, but she felt it. I am not here to adjudicate what happened in Copper Hollow, Aldrich said carefully. I'm here to determine whether the property filing before me is accurate. He looked at the two documents. Mr. Harlow, he addressed the attorney, can you explain the coordinate discrepancy between these two surveys? Harlow reached for the documents. Commissioner, the original survey was conducted under conditions that have since been clarified by, I'd like you to address the specific numerical difference, Aldrich said. The northern boundary coordinates. In the original, the boundary runs at. He read the numbers, and in the new filing, it runs at. He read the new numbers. Those are not a correction. Those are a relocation. Can you explain the basis for that relocation? Harlow was good at his work. Could see that. He pivoted smoothly. A resurvey was commissioned by the Vale Company following irregularities in the original measurement, Commissioner. The new survey reflects. Who conducted the original survey? Aldrich asked. Territorial Surveying Office 6 years ago, Mabel said. The stamp and certification are on the document. Aldrich looked at the stamp, and the new survey was conducted by a private surveying firm retained by the Vale Company, Harlow said, whose coordinates conveniently move the boundary 50 feet in the direction that benefits the firm's client, Colter said from his place at the side of the room. It was the first thing he'd said since Mabel had come in, and he said it without heat, just as an observation of the obvious. Harlow turned to him. Mr. Dane, the resurvey was conducted by a licensed. I also have documentation of survey stakes placed on my property along the North Creek bank within the last 2 weeks, Colter said. Stakes that were not there on the 14th of this month, which I can establish through the testimony of a neighboring property holder who walks that section of creek regularly. He paused. Stakes that correspond to the new boundary coordinates in your filing, not the original ones. Bram Vale's hands, which had been flat on the table, curled slowly. It was the first physical sign she'd seen from him that anything was not entirely controlled. She noticed it and moved past it. Commissioner, she said, I'd also like to submit a separate document. She withdrew the folded page from the wooden box, the freight arrangement with Cutter. She placed it on the table beside the survey. This is a signed agreement establishing a scheme by which cattle freight weights were systematically overreported, with the additional fees split between the operator and another party. The families affected by this arrangement are in Copper Hollow. Several of them are prepared to provide testimony about discrepancies they noticed but were unable to account for. The room was very quiet again. Bram Vale stood up. He stood up slowly, which was more frightening than if he'd done it quickly, because it was the movement of a man who is not afraid of what standing up in this room will cost him, because he has made a prior calculation that it won't cost him anything. Commissioner Aldrich, he said, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man who has been the largest force in a room for 20 years and has not yet had reason to doubt that this situation is different. I have operated in this territory for 2 decades. I have built an operation that employs 40 men and sustains the valley's economy through hard winters. I have never sit down, Mr. Vale, Aldrich said. Pause. Commissioner, I'd like you to sit down, please, Aldrich said. Not loudly. With the specific quiet of a man who does not need volume because the authority is structural, not performative. Bram Vale sat down, and in the sitting down something changed in the room. It was not a collapse, he was not a man who collapsed, but it was a shift, a small but permanent alteration of the balance of the space. Mabel breathed. Aldrich spent the next 20 minutes reading. He read the original survey, he read the new filing. He read the freight arrangement document. He made notes in a small book he kept beside his right hand. He asked questions of Mabel, of Colter, once of Harlow, who answered with decreasing confidence as the minutes passed. He did not ask questions of Bram Vale. At the end of 20 minutes, Aldrich removed his glasses from his forehead, polished them with a cloth from his pocket, replaced them, and folded his hands on the table. I am issuing an immediate and indefinite hold on the Vale Company's new property filing, he said. I am also opening a formal inquiry into the original survey modification and the freight arrangement document presented today. Both matters will require full investigation before further action is taken. He looked at Harlow. You'll want to advise your client regarding the scope of that inquiry. Harlow nodded, his face carefully composed. She suspected he was already thinking about fees and the length of what was coming. Aldrich looked at Mabel. Miss Whitlock, the original survey document will need to remain with this office as evidence. You'll be required to provide a formal statement regarding how and where you recovered it. I understand. And you'll be called to testify during the inquiry. He paused. Both of you, he added, looking at Colter. We'll be here, Colter said. Aldrich nodded, gathered his papers, and stood. The hearing was over. Bram Vale did not look at Mabel when he left the room. He walked out with his attorney close behind him, and his face arranged in the expression she imagined he'd been wearing for 20 years, the certainty of a man who has resources and time and the patience to use them. He was not broken. She understood that. This was not the end of Bram Vale's ability to make things difficult. It was the beginning of a process that would take months and cost everyone involved more than they had currently budgeted. But the document was on Aldrich's desk. The hold was in place. The false survey stake along Ironwater Creek would not become an official boundary line today, or next week, or while the inquiry ran. She stood in the emptied hearing room and felt the specific exhaustion that arrives after sustained alertness, not the pleasant tiredness of physical work, but the deep cellular kind. the kind that comes from operating at full capacity for an extended period and finally being allowed to stop. Colter came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "You all right?" he said finally. "Tired," she said. "When did you last eat?" She thought about it. "Yesterday morning." "Mabel." "I had coffee," she said, "on the road." He looked at her with an expression that was not quite exasperated and not quite something else. "There's a decent eating house 2 streets over," he said. "Come on." They ate in a booth in the back of a warm room that smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat, and Mabel ate more than she had intended to because her body, once given food after significant deprivation, made its own decisions about quantities. She noticed Colter not commenting on this and appreciated it in the uncomplicated way she appreciated useful things. "Your father," Colter said over coffee. "Did he?" "He'll talk to the Mullins and the Harkers," she said, "and 2 other families with freight complaints." She set down her cup. "Whether they'll come forward is their decision. But he'll ask." Colter nodded. He turned his cup in his hands. "Garrick? Gone by now. If he was smart, he said he'd testify. Do you believe him?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "I believe he meant it when he said it," she said. "Whether he's still that person in 6 weeks when the inquiry is actually running, that I don't know. He's going to face real pressure from his father." She paused. "But Garrick drew those coordinates himself. If he testifies, that testimony is specific and technical, and very difficult to contradict. And I think he knows that the only version of his future that doesn't include his father's judgment hanging over him forever is one where he's on record as having told the truth." "That's a cold way to think about someone's motivations," Colter said. "It's an accurate way," she said. "Cold and accurate are different things." He looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "they are." They stayed one night at the Capitol. Mabel had a room in a small boarding house near the commissioner's building, and she slept 9 hours without interruption, which was the most she had slept in a week, and woke in the gray winter morning feeling like a person who had been underwater and has returned to a surface where oxygen is available again. They rode home in easier stages than she'd ridden out. The urgency was behind them now, not gone, because the inquiry would require months of sustained work and there would be difficulties they hadn't anticipated yet, but the acute compressed urgency of the last 4 days had released its grip. The territory looked different at a reasonable pace. She noticed things she'd ridden past without seeing on the way out the particular way the winter light hit the ridge at mid-morning. The tracks of animals crossing the snow-covered road, a hawk working the thermals above the dry creek bed with complete efficiency and without apparent effort. "What happens to the ranch while the inquiry runs?" she asked on the second day of the return. "We run it," Colter said. He said it simply, without elaboration. She looked at him sideways. "You're my business partner," he said. "The offer stands." "Same terms," he paused. "There's also the matter of your wages for the week, which I haven't paid yet." She almost said it didn't matter and caught herself. It did matter. The whole point was that it mattered. "We'll settle the accounts when we're back," she said. "Fair enough." They came down the North Road into the Copper Hollow Valley on the 3rd day of the return, late afternoon, and the settlement was visible in the flat winter light, small, familiar, looking exactly as it always had. She had spent her whole life in it, and she felt neither affection nor bitterness looking at it from the road. It was a place. It had good people and bad ones, and a great many who were somewhere in between, which was what places were. She was going back into it on her own terms, which was new. Colter glanced at her. "You want to go through or around?" She thought about it for maybe 2 seconds. "Through," she said. They rode in on the main road, which was the only road, and the afternoon had enough people out that their arrival was noticed. She felt the awareness move through the visible population the way it does in small settlements, the slight adjustment of posture, the direction of attention, the way conversations paused without stopping entirely. She rode at a normal pace. She didn't look at the square directly, but she didn't avoid it either. She let it exist in her peripheral vision as she passed the open space, the packed dirt, the absence of the wagon, which had apparently been moved to somewhere behind the livery. Sheriff Alcott was standing outside his office. He saw her. She saw him see her. She did not stop. Ada Pruitt was coming out of the dry goods store with a parcel. She stopped when she saw Mabel. Their eyes met. Ada pressed her lips together, the same expression she'd worn in the square, the discomfort that hadn't been enough to make her leave. This time she looked away first. Thomas Whitlock was not visible on the street, which meant he was somewhere being useful, she hoped. They rode through Copper Hollow and out the north side and up toward the ranch, and by the time they turned onto the property tracks, the settlement was out of sight behind the ridge, and the late afternoon was going gold and cold around them, and the horses knew they were nearly home and were moving with renewed purpose. The ranch looked the same. She had been gone less than a week. The corral fence was the same. The woodpile was the same. The unfinished end of the house waited where it had always been for the work that would eventually complete it. She got down from the bay and led her into the barn and took off the saddle and rubbed her down carefully, checking the left foreleg, which was warm but no worse than it had been. She put the mare in her stall with fresh hay and filled the water. She did all of this methodically and thoroughly, the way she did everything, because the animal had carried her hard for 2 days and deserved the same quality of attention as anything else that had worked that hard. When she came out of the barn, Colter was sitting on the porch step with 2 cups of coffee. She didn't know when he'd made them. She sat down beside him on the step and took the cup, and they sat in the early dark with the stars coming out above the ridge and the cold settling properly around them. "What does the inquiry look like?" she said, realistically. He thought about it. "Months," he said. "Vale will fight every step. His attorney is good and he has resources." He paused. "The hold is in place. And Aldrich is not a man who forgets what he's seen. Garrick's testimony will matter most," she said. If he holds. If he holds. "And the families from Copper Hollow," she said. Thomas actually got to them. 3 days later, he had. Thomas Whitlock arrived at the ranch on a borrowed horse in the early morning, looking like a man who had slept badly for the better part of a week and was beginning to understand that this was what being useful sometimes cost. He stood in the yard and looked at his daughter, who came to the porch door and looked back at him. "Mullins will testify," he said. "Both of them." Eliza Mullen was the one who kept the records of the freight weights she'd been noting the discrepancies for 2 years in her household account book because she thought she was doing the arithmetic wrong. His voice had a rough quality. "She wasn't doing the arithmetic wrong." Mabel nodded. "Who else?" "Harkers will come forward. And a family named Breslin. 20 miles south, they lost a significant piece of land in a debt dispute with Vale 3 years ago that I'm starting to think might have been engineered the same way." He paused. "The freight man. Cutter, he's gone. Cleared out of Copper Hollow sometime in the last 2 days. Nobody knows where. He'll surface," Colter said from behind Mabel. "Men like that always do." Thomas looked at Colter for a moment. Something passed between them, an assessment, a negotiation conducted without words. "You're the man who cut the rope," Thomas said. "I am," Colter said. Thomas nodded slowly. He looked back at his daughter. "Mabel." He stopped. Started again. "I went to the Mullins and I went to the Harkers and I sat in the Breslin kitchen for 3 hours explaining what was done to them and what it might cost to stand up and say so." He paused. "I did that because it was the right thing and because you asked me to. But I also did it because I needed to understand what it felt like to stand up for something when it was uncomfortable." He was looking at his hands, then up at her. "I understand now that you've been doing that your whole life, and I let you do it alone." The morning was cold and still around them. A horse shifted in the corral. Mabel looked at her father for a long moment. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold and there's coffee." He came in, and they sat at the rough-hewn table, the 3 of them, and went through everything that would need to happen in the coming weeks, methodically and practically, and she kept her focus on the work because the work was where she could be useful, and because the conversation with her father about the rest of it would happen in its own time, when the immediate things were handled and there was space for it. But when Thomas left in the late morning, she stood at the porch and watched him ride south, and she noticed that he sat the horse differently than he had when he'd arrived. Straighter, like a man who had put something down that he'd been carrying wrong. She went back inside. Colter was at the table with papers spread in front of him, the next stage of what needed to be organized for the inquiry. She sat down across from him and pulled the ledger toward her and opened it to the next blank page. "Start with the Breslin situation," she said. "If their land dispute was engineered the way I think it was, there will be a paper trail. There always is." Colter slid a folder across the table. "Already pulled what I had." She opened it and read. She found the first error within 4 minutes, which was about what she expected, and she picked up her pencil and began to note it in the margin in her small, precise hand, and the ranch settled into the familiar sounds of winter work around them, the fire, the horses, the wind off the ridge, and the day moved forward with the particular unspectacular determination of people who have a great deal to do and intend to do it. The inquiry notice arrived from the commissioner's office 6 days later. The hearing was set for 8 weeks out. There was a list of required documents, a list of potential witnesses, and a separate letter from Aldrich's office noting that a Garrick Vale had presented himself voluntarily and submitted a preliminary affidavit regarding the survey modification he had held. Mabel read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table with the other relevant documents and made a note in the ledger and moved on to the next item, because there were 11 more things requiring attention that afternoon, and the inquiry was 8 weeks away, and 8 weeks was enough time to do this properly if they didn't waste any of it. Outside, the Wyoming Territory winter held its cold and indifferent ground, and Ironwater Creek ran dark and steady through the frozen land, exactly where it had always run, waiting for someone to finally put the correct boundary on the correct document and leave it there. The 8 weeks before the inquiry did not pass quietly. Mabel had not expected them to. She had known, sitting at that table with the commissioner's notice in front of her, that the period between the hold and the hearing would be the most dangerous stretch the window in which Bram Vale had time and motivation to dismantle what they'd built, and in which every witness who had agreed to come forward would be living inside that same window, feeling the pressure of it against their daily lives. The first thing that happened was the debt notices. Thomas Whitlock received his within 4 days of the inquiry being announced, a formal letter from Vale's attorney, noting that the outstanding balance on his 4-year debt had been called for immediate repayment in full. It was a legal instrument, properly filed, and it was designed to do exactly what it did: arrive in the hands of a man who had just agreed to do something courageous and remind him precisely what courage was going to cost. Thomas brought the letter to the ranch. He put it on the table in front of Mabel and sat down across from her and did not say anything, which was how she knew it was serious. Her father talked when things were manageable and went quiet when they weren't. She read the letter. She read it twice. "How much?" Colter asked from across the room. She told him the figure. He was quiet for a moment. "Can cover it," he said. "No, Mabel." "No." She set the letter down. "If you cover my father's debt, Vale's attorney will use it at the hearing. He'll argue that you bought Thomas Whitlock's testimony, that Colter Dane paid off a debt in exchange for a witness." She looked at him steadily. "It hands them exactly the narrative they want." Colter's jaw was tight. "So what do we do?" She turned back to her father. "How long can you actually hold before the legal consequences become serious?" Thomas thought about it with the careful arithmetic of a man who has been managing a precarious situation for years. 6 weeks, he said, "maybe 7 if I'm careful." "The hearing is in 8 weeks, she said. "If the hearing goes the way I believe it will, Vale's ability to enforce that debt through his attorney becomes significantly compromised." She paused. "Can you hold 7 weeks? He looked at his hands. "I've held worse," he said, which was not exactly an answer, but was the kind of thing a man says when he's decided. The Mullins received a different kind of pressure. A Vale Ranch hand began appearing on the road past their property at irregular intervals, not doing anything, not speaking to anyone, simply being visible in the way that communicates a message without words. Eliza Mullen, who had 2 years' worth of carefully kept freight weight discrepancies in her household account book, and the specific fearlessness of a woman who had been quietly furious about them for all that time, sent a written description of the harassment to Aldrich's office with dates and times and a clear explanation of its apparent purpose. Aldrich sent a letter to Vale's attorney, noting that any appearance of witness intimidation would result in additional inquiry complications. The ranch hands stopped appearing on the Mullen Road. Garrick's preliminary affidavit became a point of sustained pressure in itself, Bram Vale's attorney argued, in a series of letters to Aldrich's office that Mabel read copies of with the cold attention she gave to all documents that were trying to do something to her situation, that Garrick was acting under mental and emotional distress, that his affidavit was the product of a family dispute rather than genuine testimony, and that the commissioner should weight it accordingly. The letters were well constructed. She had to give Harlow credit for that. He was doing what attorneys do, which is find the weakest joint in the structure and apply sustained force to it. She wrote a response. Not on her own behalf, she had no official standing to respond to communications between attorneys in the commissioner's office, but she wrote a detailed analysis of the specific technical elements of Garrick's affidavit, the coordinate descriptions and surveying terminology, and the sequence of decisions Garrick had described, and she gave it to Aldrich's investigator when he came through Copper Hollow in the 5th week to gather supplementary statements. She explained to the investigator, without drama, why the technical specificity of Garrick's testimony made it nearly impossible to fabricate that the precise relationship between the original coordinates and the modified ones described a process that only someone who had performed it could accurately reconstruct. The investigator was a quiet man named Briggs, who wrote everything down in a small notebook and asked follow-up questions that told her he understood what she was saying. She considered that a reasonable outcome. In the 6th week, Cutter the freight operator was located in a settlement 2 territories east. He had not gone far enough. The inquiry's authority extended to him through his signed agreement with Vale, and when the investigator arrived at his new location with a copy of the document Mabel had removed from the wooden box, Cutter made a pragmatic decision and agreed to provide a statement in exchange for consideration regarding his own exposure. Mabel heard about this through Aldrich's office and did not feel satisfaction exactly. She felt the specific recognition of a calculation that had been correct, that the freight arrangement document was not a peripheral piece of evidence, but a central one, that it demonstrated a pattern of deliberate systematic fraud that made the survey modification not an isolated incident, but a continuation of an established method. Bram Vale, she was coming to understand more fully as the weeks accumulated, had not done one bad thing or even several. He had built a system. The survey, the freight weights, the debt instruments, the public disgracing these were not separate problems. They were components of a single architecture designed to concentrate power by making it impossible for smaller, less resourced people to challenge him effectively. The wagon in the square was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a mechanism. She was meant to be the example of what happened to people who looked too closely. The recognition of this did not make her angry in the consuming way anger can be. It made her precise. There is a particular quality of focused, cold clarity that arrives when you understand not just what was done but how and why, and that clarity was more useful to her than fury would have been. The hearing was held on a Tuesday in early February, which in Wyoming territory meant the kind of morning that demands specific respect for the distance between indoors and outdoors. Commissioner's building was full. Word had traveled not just through Copper Hollow, but through several surrounding settlements, and the waiting room outside the hearing chamber held more people than it was designed for. Ranchers and farm families, and a scattering of town people standing in their coats with the particular expression of people who have a stake in something they can't directly influence. Mabel arrived with Colter and Thomas Whitlock, who had aged visibly in the 8 weeks since the inquiry notice, and carried himself with the careful bearing of a man trying to make sure his posture communicated something his history hadn't always managed to. Eliza Mullen was already there with her husband. She had her household account book under her arm, 2 years of careful records in her own handwriting, and she looked at Mabel when they came in with the direct, steady expression of one competent woman recognizing another. The Harkers were there, the Breslin family, who had made a 2-day journey. 2 other families Mabel recognized from the valley whose names she knew from accounts, but whose faces she matched to names for the first time standing in that crowded anteroom. Leon Devereaux was there. He had ridden alone and arrived looking like a man for whom a February journey was a minor inconvenience, and the prospect of finally saying in an official room what he had been observing for years was adequate compensation. Garrick Vale arrived 10 minutes before the hearing opened. He came alone, without an attorney of his own, which Mabel thought was either a statement or a miscalculation, and she wasn't yet sure which. He looked thinner than she remembered. He found her eyes across the room and held them for a moment, and then looked away, and she thought about what it cost a person to walk into a building and prepare to testify against their own father, and she thought it cost more than she was willing to spend much energy calculating, because the cost was his to carry. Bram Vale arrived with Harlow and 2 additional attorneys, and the specific bearing of a man who has decided that the correct response to this situation is to be more of what he already was larger, more certain, more fully himself rather than less. He did not look at anyone in the anteroom except Aldrich's clerk, to whom he spoke briefly in a low voice before taking his seat inside. He did not look at Garrick. The hearing lasted 2 full days. Mabel testified for most of the first morning. She had organized her testimony the way she organized accounts chronologically, precisely, with each element connected to the next in a sequence that could be followed, even by someone who had no prior knowledge of the case. She described the Vale account review. She described what she had seen in the drawer. She described the wagon flatly, without theatrical emphasis, just what happened in the order it happened, and she watched Aldrich's face as she did, which was attentive and gave nothing away, which was what she needed from him. Harlow cross-examined her for 90 minutes. He was skilled and persistent, and he found every soft point in her account and pressed on it the fact that she had entered the Vale office without explicit current permission, the fact that her memory of the document was the basis of her initial suspicion, the fact that she had a clear personal grievance against the Vale family that predated her account review. She answered each challenge with the same precision she'd used in her direct testimony, not becoming defensive, not elaborating beyond what was asked, not giving him more surface area to work with than necessary. At one point he asked her directly, "Miss Whitlock, isn't it true that your presence in Garrick Vale's office on both occasions was unauthorized?" "The first occasion was authorized by Garrick Vale himself," she said. "The second occasion I was given access to the office." "By whom?" "By the person who left the door unlocked and the office unattended during the hours I was there." "That's a creative interpretation of access," Harlow said. "It's the accurate one," she said. Aldrich made a small note. Mabel noted him making it. Leon Devereaux testified after lunch. He was concise and entirely unintimidated by the formal setting, which made sense for a man who had been navigating difficult terrain without assistance for 70-something years. He described the survey stakes, described the dates, described the difference between what had been there and what had appeared. When Harlow suggested that his memory for specific dates might be imperfect for a man of his age, Leon looked at him with the expression of someone who has heard sillier things and chosen not to respond to them. and said that he had been walking that section of creek for 15 years, and he knew the difference between a stake that had always been there and one that hadn't. Eliza Mullen's testimony was the one that changed the room's quality most visibly. She brought the account book. She opened it. She read from it dates and weights and discrepancies noted in the careful, precise handwriting of a woman who had been told, indirectly, that she was probably making arithmetic errors and had quietly continued noting the evidence that she wasn't. 2 years of it. The room got very still while she read. When she finished, she closed the book and set it on the table and looked at Aldrich and said, without particular heat but with 24 months of contained frustration behind it, I knew the numbers were wrong. My husband told me I was probably miscounting. I believed him because he's usually right about most things, and because the alternative that someone was deliberately stealing from us was a thing I didn't know what to do with. She paused. Now I know what to do with it, she said. Garrick Vale testified on the second day. He testified for 3 hours. He described the survey modification in technical detail, the coordinates, the process, the instructions he'd received, the date. He described his father's freight arrangement with Cutter, with the specific knowledge of someone who had been present at the margins of those conversations long enough to understand what was being arranged. He described the decision to publicly disgrace Mabel Whitlock not as something he had planned, but as something he had known was coming and had failed to prevent. Harlow's cross-examination of Garrick was the longest of the hearing. It was also the most difficult to watch, in the specific way it is difficult to watch a person be asked repeatedly, in varied framings, whether they are lying, whether they are motivated by spite, whether the picture they are presenting of their own family is the product of a troubled mind rather than accurate memory. Garrick answered each question. His voice was not steady throughout. It broke once, slightly, when Harlow asked about a specific conversation with his father regarding the survey stakes, but he answered, and the answers were consistent, and the technical details remained exactly what they had been in the affidavit, which was what mattered most. Bram Vale did not testify. Harlow advised against it, which Mabel thought was the correct legal call, and also the one moment in the proceedings where she felt something close to frustrated, because she had spent 2 months preparing for the particular confrontation of watching Bram Vale attempt to explain his own documents under oath, and she would not get to see it. The documents were there. The original survey. The freight arrangement. Eliza Mullen's account book. Garrick's detailed affidavit. Cutter's statement. Leon Devereaux's testimony about the stakes. Her own reconstructed ledger from memory, supplemented by the documentary record. The Breslin land dispute analysis that she and Colter had assembled over 3 weeks in the ranch's lamplight, which demonstrated through deed records and debt instruments how a neighboring property had been maneuvered into default through the same architecture of manufactured obligation. Aldrich delivered his ruling on the third day, in a written decision that he read aloud with the methodical care of a man who understands that words in official documents have consequences and should be said correctly the first time. The Vale Company's new property survey was invalidated. The original boundary of the Dane property along Ironwater Creek was confirmed and recorded permanently with the Territorial Office. The freight arrangement constituted criminal fraud and was referred to the territorial prosecutor with a recommendation for charges. The Breslin land dispute was reopened for review. All Vale property filings within the valley over the preceding 5 years were flagged for independent re-examination. When Aldrich finished reading, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Thomas Whitlock, sitting 2 chairs down from his daughter, exhaled a breath that had apparently been held, in one form or another, for about 8 weeks. Mabel did not cry. She had not cried since the morning of the wagon, and she was not going to start in a commissioner's hearing room in February with 40 people watching. She sat with her hands folded on the table and felt the specific sensation of a weight being set down that she had been carrying so long she had stopped being aware of its exact pressure, and she noted the sensation and let it be what it was. Bram Vale left the building without speaking to anyone. She watched him go. He walked like a man who was not finished, who was recalculating, who would find attorneys and file challenges and use every remaining instrument of his remaining resources to contest what had just happened. She expected that. The ruling was not the end of Bram Vale. It was the end of a particular version of his power, which was different. Garrick was outside on the building's front steps when they came out. He was standing with his coat collar up against the February cold, looking at the street below with the expression of a man who has done something irreversible and is now on the other side of it, finding out what the other side feels like. He looked at Mabel when she came through the door. "Thank you," she said, which surprised her slightly as she said it, because gratitude was not what she had expected to feel toward Garrick Vale at any point in her recent life. He shook his head. "Don't. You held," she said. "That's worth something." He was quiet for a moment. "I drew those coordinates," he said. I did it with my own hand. Thank you isn't something I'm entitled to. He looked back at the street. I'm leaving the territory. Not running, I've left a contact address with Aldrich's office. But I can't stay here. I know, she said. He looked at her one more time, and there was something in his face that was not quite absolution-seeking and not quite goodbye. More like the expression of a man making an honest accounting of what he had done and what it had cost other people, and deciding to carry it correctly rather than set it down. He walked down the steps and into the February street, and she watched him go and then turned back to the people around her, because there was still work to do and the present moment required her attention. The return to Copper Hollow was not a triumphant procession. It was a group of tired people on horses and in a borrowed wagon, traveling at the pace the weather and the animals allowed, arriving in the valley over the course of an afternoon with the unglamorous quality of people who have completed something difficult and are now thinking about what comes next. Word had arrived before them, the way word always does in small valleys traveling through some invisible network of proximity and interest. That means news is never quite a surprise by the time you bring it yourself. The ruling was known. The Whitlock debt, which had been issued against Bram Vale's assets and was currently entangled in the same legal proceedings as everything else connected to the Vale operation, was effectively suspended pending the outcome of the fraud charges. Thomas Whitlock's immediate crisis had not resolved, but it had transformed from a weapon into a question, which was a different kind of situation. Mabel did not go back to her father's house. She went back to the ranch. She went back because that was where her work was: the ledger and the accounts, and the winter feeding schedule, and the sorrel's left foreleg, and the unfinished end of the house that Colter was planning to complete before spring if the materials arrived on time. She went back because she had agreed to a partnership, and the partnership had not concluded because the inquiry had. She went back because the ranch was where she had spent the last 3 months doing work that mattered, and being seen clearly by at least one person. And because that was worth more to her than returning to a town that owed her an apology it would deliver badly and incompletely. But she did go into Copper Hollow. Not the day she returned, and not the next day. She waited until she had slept properly and eaten 2 good meals and checked the stock and sat at the table with the accounts for 3 quiet hours, getting herself back into the ordinary rhythm of the work. Then she rode into town. It was a Saturday, which meant people were out. She tied the bay at the hitching post in front of the dry goods store and walked into the square. She stood in it for a moment. The wagon was gone. The space was what it had always been: dirt, fence posts, the usual furniture of a working settlement's central space. She stood where she had stood with the rope on her wrists, and she looked at the buildings around it and the people who were beginning to notice her, and she did not feel afraid or angry or vindicated. She felt like herself, standing in a place that had tried to make her something smaller and had failed. People came. Not all at once. This was Copper Hollow. Not a theatrical performance, but in the way things happen in small places, one at a time or in pairs, with the specific awkwardness of people who owe something and are not entirely sure how to begin paying it. Ada Pruitt came first. She stood in front of Mabel with her parcel under her arm and her pressed lips doing their usual work of containing whatever she was actually feeling, and then she said, "I should have left the square that morning." "I want you to know I know that." Mabel looked at her. "Yes," she said, "you should have." She didn't add anything to it. She let Ada carry the weight of the accurate answer without softening it for her. Mrs. Clement came. She said she had written to her sister in another territory about what had happened, and her sister had written back that it was exactly the kind of thing that happened when a town let powerful men define what was respectable. Mabel thought that was a fair assessment. She said so. The Harker brothers came and shook her hand, which was awkward for all 3 of them and also genuine, which was more than she had expected from them. Sheriff Alcott did not come to the square. He came to the ranch 3 days later, alone, and knocked on the door, and when Colter opened it, Alcott asked to speak to Mabel. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and told her that he had allowed a situation to occur that he should have stopped, that he had weighed the practical consequences of opposing Bram Vale against his responsibility to the law and had made the wrong choice, and that he intended to resign his position at the end of the month. She looked at him for a long time. "Don't resign," she said. He blinked. "You made a bad decision," she said. "People who make bad decisions and then leave don't have to live with the consequences of changing. Copper Hollow needs a sheriff. Be a better one." She paused. "The town council is going to abolish the practice of unofficial public punishments next month. I've already spoken to 3 council members who agree it needs to happen. When that comes up for a vote, be present and be on the right side of it." He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on Alcott's face before, which was the particular expression of a person being offered a harder thing than what they had offered themselves. "All right," he said, that word in his voice which she had last heard in the square authorizing a rope. It was different now. He put his hat back on and rode back to Copper Hollow, and she watched him go and hoped he meant it, and accepted that she couldn't know for certain and moved on. Town council meeting was 3 weeks later. The square was fuller than a regular meeting warranted, which meant people understood that something definitive was being established. The motion to formally prohibit unofficial public punishments, public humiliation, physical restraint of accused persons without due legal process, any form of community-sanctioned shaming passed by a clear majority. Mabel was in the room. She did not speak during the meeting. She had said what needed saying to the people who needed to hear it, in private conversations over the preceding weeks, and the vote was its own thing now, belonging to the town rather than to her. She sat in the back and listened to the vote and then walked out into the cold evening air and thought that this was how change actually worked, not in a single transformative moment, but in the accumulated weight of specific people making specific decisions in specific rooms, imperfectly and with mixed motivations and better than they had done before. It was not a satisfying philosophy. It was an accurate one. The Breslin Land Review took 4 more months, but the result returned the disputed property to the family. Cutter's fraud charges resulted in repayment orders against his assets, which distributed back to the 11 affected families in amounts that were meaningful without being complete, which was how restitution usually worked. Imperfectly, better than nothing. Bram Vale's challenges to Aldrich's ruling were filed and reviewed and denied and filed again in a different form, and the process ground on through the rest of the year with the slow institutional momentum of legal proceedings, but the original boundary of the Dane property remained in the territorial record, confirmed and permanent, and Ironwater Creek ran where it had always run. Thomas Whitlock's debt was formally discharged in the fall when Vale's attorney, faced with the weight of the fraud findings, negotiated a settlement that cleared several outstanding instruments as part of a broader resolution. Thomas came to the ranch when he received the notice, and Mabel made coffee, and they sat at the table and talked about it in the way two people talk when they are still relearning how to be family after a significant rupture, carefully, with attention to where the floor was still uncertain. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, "about what I would have needed, back when I was your age, to do what you did." She looked at him. "What do you think you would have needed?" He thought about it seriously. "Fewer debts," he said finally, "and less practice at being afraid." He turned his cup in his hands. "I had the first. I kept adding to the second." She understood something from that, not that her father was excused, but that the architecture of what the Vale family had built had depended on fear as much as fraud. The debt notices and the freight overcharges and the survey stakes were mechanisms, yes, but they worked because they had first cultivated the kind of ongoing low-level dread that makes people doubt their own arithmetic, tell themselves they've miscounted, decide that the most powerful man in the valley is probably right, and they are probably wrong. The wagon in the square had been the same mechanism, aimed at her. The difference, she thought, was that she had never quite believed her own arithmetic was wrong. Not because she was fearless, she had been afraid, genuinely, on the road to the territorial capital with documents inside her coat and a 2-day ride ahead of her. But she had been afraid the way a person is afraid of a real and specific danger, not the formless dread of a person who has been made to doubt their own perception of reality. And she had kept moving anyway, because the numbers were the numbers, and they said what they said, regardless of what anyone wanted them to say. That was, she supposed, the thing she knew how to do that other people sometimes didn't. Hold the number and the fear at the same time, and act on the number. It wasn't a gift. It was a habit she'd built over 24 years of being a person who had to prove she was worth listening to before anyone would listen. There was nothing glorious about the origin of it, but it had been enough. Spring came to the ranch the way it always does in Wyoming territory, not gently, not all at once, but in arguments, warm days followed by late frosts, the ground softening and then hardening again, creek running higher with snowmelt from the upper ridge. The sorrel's left foreleg had improved through the winter under the modified care Mabel had established, and she was moving cleanly now in the morning, which Mabel considered one of the more personally satisfying outcomes of the preceding months. The unfinished end of the house was completed in April. Colter and 2 hired hands worked through a week of mixed weather to finish it, and when it was done the house was what it had always been, structurally capable of being complete, level, solid, kind of building that would be standing in 50 years, because the bones had been laid correctly. Mabel added the completed room to the account of the property's assets in the ledger. Then she went and stood in the doorway of it and looked at the new walls and the window that faced east, toward the creek, and thought about how much had happened in the specific space of one winter. The porch was finished by May. Colter built it himself, mostly over the course of 2 weeks in the evenings after the day's work was done. It ran the length of the south face of the house and looked out over the front pasture to the ridge beyond, and when he finished the last board, he stood back and looked at it with the expression of a man who has completed a thing he had been wanting to complete for some time. He found Mabel in the barn doing the evening feed and said, without particular ceremony, that the porch was done if she wanted to see it. She came out and looked at it. It was a good porch, properly leveled, solid at the posts, with enough width to actually sit on and watch the light change over the pasture. A functional thing that also happened to be, in the way that well-made functional things sometimes are, genuinely beautiful. They sat on it in the long spring evening with the horses moving in the pasture below, and the ridge going gold in the late light in the creek somewhere to the north running at its proper level in its proper place. "I want to ask you something," Colter said. She looked at him. She had known, without precisely deciding that she knew, that a conversation of a certain kind was approaching, had felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the specific evidence of it arrives, in the air and the light, and the way things are still before they're not. She had not hurried it or avoided it. She had let it come at its own pace, which was the only pace either of them was capable of with things that mattered. "Then ask," she said. He looked at her directly, the way he always did when something was important to him, no sideways approach, no building toward it. "Mabel Whitlock," he said, "will you marry me?" She sat with that for a moment. Not because she was uncertain. She knew the answer with the same clarity she knew the column totals in a well-kept ledger, but because she wanted to give it the space it deserved. The question was not a small one. It was the question of what kind of life she intended to build, and with whom, and on what terms. She thought about what had brought her to this porch, the rope and the square and the 40 people who had watched, the cold 2 hours against a rock on the road to the Capitol, false panel behind the cabinet, her father's hands on his kitchen table, Eliza Mullen's account book with 2 years of careful, furious record-keeping, Leon Devereaux saying, "I know the difference." She thought about a man who had ridden into a town square and asked to see the law before he cut the rope, and then stepped back and given her room to stand on her own. "Yes," she said. He nodded like that was a reasonable and expected answer, and she appreciated that about him, that he didn't perform surprise at things he had known were true. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat in the spring evening with the pasture in front of them and the sound of the creek somewhere to the north in the sky, doing what Wyoming skies do in May, which is go through several different versions of beautiful in the space of an hour. "The accounts for the breeding operation," she said after a while. He looked at her. "Right now? I want to restructure the tracking system before we add the new mares," she said. "If we're going into a proper breeding program, I want a ledger format that can handle the bloodline records alongside the financial records without getting tangled." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, is this you saying yes to a marriage proposal and immediately returning to work?" "I said yes 20 minutes ago," she said. The work was always going to still be there. He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind he didn't produce often, the kind that arrived without being constructed, and she looked at him sideways and felt something she had spent a long time not being sure she would get to feel, the particular warmth of being known by someone. Not idealized, not reduced to a single story, not explained by her size or her circumstances or what anyone in Copper Hollow had decided about her before she'd had a chance to demonstrate otherwise. Known. The actual person, the whole complicated, accurate version of her. People talk about love like it arrives all at once, like a door opening onto a fully furnished room. But Mabel Whitlock had learned enough, in 24 years of being careful with what she knew, to understand that the things worth having are usually built the same way a ranch is built, slowly, from sound materials, with attention to the bones, imperfectly and with setbacks, until one day you look at what you've made and understand that it was worth every hard season it took to get there. Copper Hollow told the story for years afterward. The large young woman tied to the wagon, the stranger who asked to see the law, the winter they finally understood what had been done to them, and by whom, and what one person with a clear memory and a willingness to ride into the cold had been able to do about it. The old-timers told it the way people tell the stories that changed the shape of a place with the weight of something that mattered, with the understanding that what looks like a single moment is usually the surface of a much longer and quieter courage. They had looked at Mabel Whitlock and seen a body in a story they wanted to write for her. Colter Dane had looked at her and seen what she could do, and Mabel had always known what she was worth. She had simply needed the winter to prove it to everyone else. The creek ran. The ranch stood. The ledger filled with the careful, precise record of a life being built on honest ground. And that in the end was enough. More than enough. It was everything.